but I couldn't see enough examples of the travel account to offer any sort of expertise about it. And with that, we'll begin. So, on 12th May 1798, Captain George Vancouver died. This may be an incongruous and dismal way to start a talk, but for Vancouver, the 3 years leading to his death had been a particularly incongruous and dismal time. Since returning from his 4-year circumnavigation, during which he surveyed hundreds of miles of rugged coastline and disproved the existence of the Northwest Passage between 30 degrees and 60 degrees north latitude, Vancouver had found nothing but grievance. Settled on half pay, the ill health that had begun during the grueling survey seasons on the northwest coast of North America returned. A disgruntled midshipman, Thomas Pitt, Lord Camelford, at first challenged Vancouver to a duel, and then tried to attack his former commander in the street, inspiring this cartoon by James Gilray. As is typical of Gilray, the cartoon is rife with details that offer a window into the wider issues surrounding the event. In this case, they show how the British public viewed Pacific voyages and their commanders. Behind the men is a South Sea fur warehouse, which sells fine black otter skins and supposedly abhors the sale of contraband goods. Speaking of contraband, on Vancouver's back is a feather cloak with the inscription explaining that it was a present from the King of Hawaii to King George III, which Vancouver, quote, forgot to be delivered, end quote. Behind Vancouver are sets of shackles with a label that reads, "For the Navy." Unfurling out of Vancouver's pocket is a list of those disgraced during the voyage, which includes, quote, "put into irons every gentleman on board," end quote. In the pocket of Charles Vancouver, George's brother, who's between the two men in uniform, is a letter that says, "Letter to be, quote, letter to be published after the parties are bound to keep the peace," end quote. Finally, under Vancouver's foot is a notebook with a letter to Lord Granville, then Foreign Secretary, with the words, quote, "Every officer is the guardian of his own honor," end quote. The cartoon suggests that the South Seas were understood through the prism of the large-scale naval expeditions and, increasingly, the trade vessels that plied the waters of the Antipodes. The British public consumed the Pacific via word of mouth, second-hand reports published in accounts, newspapers, and maps, as well as in cartoons like this. These voyages were often accompanied by accusations of brutality, as in the case of Vancouver and more famously William Bligh, and shady dealings, as in the case of the nascent fur trade. While I could easily spend our time together this morning in a close reading of this cartoon, I instead wish to draw your attention to the very textuality of the naval captain as presented in this image. Vancouver's pocket is stuffed with a list, one of the many paper records a commander kept while at sea and on shore. Logbooks, journals, court-martial papers, reports to the Admiralty, letters to relatives and colleagues, all of these were part of the routine duties of a naval officer. Additionally, officers interacted with print as well as manuscript. They consulted previously published voyage accounts, pored over printed charts, and consulted lunar tables to calculate longitude, as just a few examples. Officers who visited the Pacific had an additional paper possibility, and in some cases, a responsibility: the writing and publication of a voyage account complete with maps and charts of seldom seen South Seas. Indeed, Vancouver was preparing the text of his voyage account when he died. It was finalized by another brother, John, and published in the summer of 1798 in 3 quarto volumes with an accompanying folio atlas, a rather handsome version of which you see on the slide. Prior to his untimely death, it was assumed that Vancouver, as the commander, would transform his journal and drafts, and those of his officers, into the official published account of the voyage, complete with an accompanying atlas that would intrigue armchair travelers, but also guide mariners. As Adriana Krachin, Michael Bravo, and others have explained, by the early 19th century, state-sponsored voyages to previously uncharted areas were subject to a print monopoly upon their return. The Admiralty seized logs and charts, preparing them to be published as expensive, single-author quarto narratives by their official bookseller, John Murray. The authorized accounts were then reviewed by Murray's Quarterly Review, which was edited by John Wilson Croker, first secretary to the Admiralty, with some reviews by John Barrow, second secretary to the Admiralty. If an exclusive publication stream had developed by the early 19th century, it begs the question, How were previous publications produced? What networks of individuals and institutions, if any, governed how voyage publications were marketed? From the first commissioned expedition to the South Seas in 1669 to the voyage of George Vancouver in 1791, the Admiralty increasingly involved themselves in the publication of voyage accounts and charts. They did so to manage their public image, but also to authenticate imperial claims. By the 1770s, exploration had become dependent on publication for its legitimation in the eyes of international diplomacy and the intellectual community. However, precisely how to create an optimum voyage account for diverse audiences was still a matter of considerable debate. In this paper, I want to defamiliarize the association of the voyage with the voyage account. Historians look to published voyage accounts as some of the most important and sometimes the only extant sources for an expedition. But the process by which a voyage account and its accompanying charts came to publication is often overlooked. During the long 18th century, the Pacific remained a starkly daunting and later an exotic locale visited by very few. Those that did visit could expect a receptive audience for their adventures, making the Pacific a particularly rich laboratory for the development of travel writing and cartography in this period. Unlike its fellow European imperial nations, England and later Britain lacked a centralized geographic repository. Spain locked away its journals and updated its master chart, the Padrón Real, in the Casa de la Contratación, as we heard yesterday from our keynote speaker, and Portugal had a similar institution. The Dutch East India Company closely guarded their sailing directions, maps, and charts that they needed to maintain and expand their trade, although their official hydrographers also maintained private businesses, so that's a bit of a contradiction there. France had a lively map trade, yet also had a censorial system in place via state-sponsored royal geographers who could be required to suppress information for king and country. While Britain's mapmakers were certainly supportive of the Royal Navy and the Crown, they did not directly work for them in any official capacity. Even those who carried the title of geographer to the king had only that, a title, which might attract customers and included very little financial support. Some of the mapmakers' most important clients were naval officers, as the Royal Navy did not provide charts for their ships until the early 19th century. Thus, British sailors and government officials by and large depended on geographic knowledge that was available on an open market, making the publication and circulation of travel accounts, maps, and charts of particular importance in the British case. This importance was compounded for a remote region like the Pacific, which had little in either manuscript or print for consultation. Over the course of 4 examples, which are laid out here, I will examine the constellation of actors and outputs involved in the sharing of the geographic information gathered on ship. These case studies are selected in order to contrast approaches to the publication of geographic knowledge. They are not intended to offer a complete portrait of the development of naval or cartographic publication in this period, but rather to highlight certain trends in the format, authorship of, and audience for Pacific geographic knowledge. All of the voyages discussed here will be state-sponsored naval expeditions, yet the involvement of the Royal Navy in publication will prove to be variable and inconsistent. By the time of our final case study, that of Vancouver, the Admiralty dependably required the creation of official voyage accounts with usable charts, yet the preferred format and editing process was still unsettled. To jump in, on August 30th, 1669, Sir John Narborough was ordered, quote, to make a discovery both of the seas and coasts in that part of the world, and if it be possible, to lay the foundation of a trade, end quote. That part of the world was the coasts of Patagonia, modern-day Chile and Argentina, an area nominally controlled by the Spanish and assumed to be as rich as Peru to the north. His orders were prepared by the future James II, then Duke of York and Lord High Admiral, Prince Rupert, Privy Councillor and Naval Officer, the 1st Earl of Arlington, Secretary of State of the South, and the 1st Earl of Sandwich and the 6th Earl of Ossory, both politicians and experienced naval officers. In addition, Charles II was well aware of the expedition and, quote, His Majesty was pleased to give homage to the voyage, end quote. Narborough sailed out of the Downs in September 1669, reached Valdivia, Chile in December 1670, and returned to England via the Straits of Magellan in June 1671. Discovery, as laid out in Narborough's instructions, referred to the need to take careful navigational measurements. Whereas every experienced naval officer was expected to keep a log and perhaps sketch charts, the unknown geography of the Straits of Magellan and the South Seas made the careful recording of hydrographic and geographic information all the more important. Indeed, as Narborough had no luck in furthering trade with either indigenous Patagonians or Chilean settlers, his charts and journals became the most valuable outcomes of the voyage. Upon his return, the first thing Narborough did was to show his patrons his drafts. Some of these presentation charts still exist, which you saw on the previous slide and this slide. This one is magnificently about 6 feet wide. It's a wonderful object. And their examination reveals how Narborough and others refined the size and content of his hydrographic imagery over time. However, although he was trained in taking measurements and rough sketches, Narborough was not necessarily schooled in creating luxurious cartographic manuscripts fit for display. Thus, it is likely that Narborough turned to, or was ordered to work with, chartmaker John Thornton, who in turn converted the manuscript to a smaller print edition. Thornton's engraved chart offered a wider audience than the Admiralty, administrators, and royals, one of the very first detailed glimpses of the Straits of Magellan. And I'll just toggle back and forth quickly so you can see that a lot of that illustrative content, we have 10 indigenous people here with some of the huts, and so a lot of that more drawing imagery will be eliminated as we go to the first printed chart, and you'll notice that that continues as a process as the printed charts go forward. I just wanted to point that out. So despite the interest of the naval elite in Narborough's charts, these men were not sufficiently connected to the print industry to influence how publications portrayed the voyage, nor did they seem too interested in the task at the time. Such work was left to entrepreneurial publishers and print sellers, like Thornton and his contemporary John Seller. In Atlas Maritimus of 1675, Seller dedicated a map of Brazil and the South Atlantic, quote, to that valiant and worthy commander, Captain John Narborough, who passed and repassed the Straits of Magellan in the year 1670, end quote. Seller was basing his own reputation as a maker of useful and updated charts on the achievements of Narborough, whose exploits must have been well known by 1675. Narborough's voyage, traced clearly via soundings and measurements on various charts, portrayed the Straits as particularly and recently English. His drawings and charts brought a little-known region to diverse audiences in different forms: presentation manuscript charts for a small, elite audience, and Thornton's sheet map for an audience of the middling sort. Narborough had also kept a journal while in the South Seas, but neither the naval elite nor publishers seemed to think it prescient or profitable to publish it during his lifetime. Eventually, though, others would see value in the journal. Whereas the Admiralty focused on discovering trade routes and ports, the Royal Society was interested in collecting and cataloging a more complete understanding of the globe. The Royal Society not only collected information, but disseminated it, albeit usually to a restricted audience of social and intellectual savants. Their findings were discussed at meetings, circulated in private letters, and printed in the Philosophical Transactions, the world's first natural philosophy periodical. Individual fellows could pursue publications using the Society's printer, and this was the case with Narborough's journal. In 1694, so over 20 years later, printers to the Royal Society, Samuel Smith and Benjamin Walford, released an octavo volume called An Account of Several Late Voyages and Discoveries to the South and North. Behind the compilation and publication of the book were 3 prominent fellows of the Royal Society: Tancred Robinson, John Ray, and Hans Sloane. Their 1694 work set its sights on the latest discoveries in the extreme north and south, 2 to each region. Narborough was given primacy not only for the geographical spaces that he traversed, but also for the types of knowledge he brought back. His status as a trustworthy and English observer, never before published, made him the major draw of the title and the subject of the largest map included with the text, which we can see here, and I apologize that it's a bit blurry. Moving on. This map, to be found prior to the title page according to the printer's instructions, was not entirely new, and you'll indeed notice that it looks a lot like Thornton's chart of 1673, but here it's rendered even more precisely than the previous printed version. The new version is stripped of practically all ornamentation, so all of the animals, now all indigenous peoples, are gone. with the exception of the large cartouche in the top right corner, which bears a dedication to Samuel Pepys. Pepys had been a naval official and was a prominent member of the Royal Society, serving as its president from 1684 to 6. In addition to his service, the last phrase of the dedication from the publishers at the beginning of the book reads, quote, "No revolution, no storm, no time can shake such foundations," end quote. And this points to a political rationale for the text and the map dedication. As a naval secretary in the government of James II, Pepys lost his position at the Admiralty in the wake of the Glorious Revolution. He had been arrested several times and was only beginning to recover his formerly prodigious public profile in 1694, the year of publication. The map therefore serves a purpose beyond conveying navigational information. It is a political tool which those behind its publication could use to highlight the careers of those they wished to support. In an added twist, the map was included when the book was republished by Smith and Walford in 1711. The title of the cartouche, so on the left is the 1694 and on the right is the 1711. So the cartouche now reads, quote, "To the Right Honourable Robert Earl of Oxford and Mortimer, Baron of Wigmore, Lord High Treasurer of Great Britain, Lord Lieutenant of Ye County of Radnor, and one of Her Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council," end quote. Pepys had died in 1703, making a dedication to him empty in terms of political capital. In rededicating the chart to Oxford, Smith and Walford hoped to attract a vibrant patron who was involved in contemporary debates surrounding the South Sea Company and a possible expedition to the Pacific. Altering the cartouche effectively erased Pepys's legacy, reorienting the book from a Royal Society project to a more general account of voyages positioned to sell copies at a time when the South Seas were once again of particular cultural salience. So the Pacific took shape for Britons not in isolation, but with reference to the concerns of an expanding commercial empire. The cultural salience of the Pacific at the turn of the 18th century was potent because it was connected to larger issues which characterized the Atlantic world, such as commerce, finance, warfare, and piracy. One of these pirates was William Dampier. Dampier would eventually circumnavigate the world 3 times, the first person to do so, but it is the first and the longest at 12 years circumnavigation that gained him his fame as a buccaneer naturalist. Somewhat miraculously, Dampier was able to keep at least some notes during his transfer to several ships and uses of other modes of transport. In 1697, James Napton, who specialized in the publication of voyage accounts, published Dampier's A New Voyage Round the World with maps by Herman Mull, who we heard about yesterday from Alex Lucas and also in the context of Gulliver. It was received with great fanfare, due in part to Dampier's thrilling and somewhat dubious status as a buccaneer, but also because he included numerous and detailed descriptions of the flora and fauna he encountered, not to mention those mole maps. It was quickly followed by second and third editions, and Dampier rapidly penned a second volume to profit off the interest in his travels. Some of those most impressed by the new voyage were fellows of the Royal Society, and, more important for our purposes, naval and government officials. The Royal Navy had not ventured into the South Seas again after the dubious results of Narborough's voyage, but they were still interested in learning as much about the Pacific as possible. The Earl of Halifax, a fellow of the Royal Society, introduced Dampier to the Earl of Orford, First Lord of the Admiralty. Dampier was then invited to craft a proposal for a voyage of exploration in the South Seas, and the Admiralty accepted in 1698. They furnished him with a ship, the Roebuck, crew, and they commissioned him as a captain. Dampier had assured luminaries like John Evelyn that, quote, "the maps hitherto extant were all false as to the Pacific Sea," end quote. Unfortunately, Dampier did not ever definitively correct those maps. His Royal Naval voyage in the Roebuck was plagued with conflicts with his crew, but it did result in new observations about Australia, even if many of Dampier's papers were lost when the ship disintegrated on the homeward journey. Dampier salvaged enough information to write A Voyage to New Holland, published by Napton in 1703. After sinking of the HMS Roebuck and with a dispute, there's some mole maps for you to look at while we do this. And with so after the sinking of the HMS Roebuck and a dispute with his first lieutenant, a court-martial found Dampier, quote, "not a fit person to be employed as commander of any of Her Majesty's ships," end quote. After another circumnavigation as a privateer, which was similarly beset with squabbles and leaky ships, the very medium that had vaulted Dampier to prominence proved his downfall. After he returned, two of his crew, William Funnell and John Welb, raked Dampier over the coals in print. Dampier countered with his own pamphlet, but its disorder and absolute incoherence only proved his detractors' points. Although Dampier's reputation as a commander was blackened, he nevertheless still demanded at least some respect as Britain's most experienced navigator in the South Seas. In his next and final South Seas voyage, Dampier would serve as a pilot in a Bristol-financed venture led by Woodes Rogers, which, if you've seen Black Sail, see figures prominently in that show. Two publications resulted from the voyage. Woodes Rogers' A Cruising Voyage Round the World, which is the coolest name for a travel account, I think, and Edward Cook's Voyage to the South Sea and Round the World. And just to show, so Woodes Rogers also had maps by Herman Moll. Moll did most of the maps in these octavo voyage accounts between about 1700 and 1726 when he did the maps in Gulliver's Travels. And so we see his signature very prominently on this world map here, and then this really interesting pull-out world map that is in two sections that I've tried to line up for you. And then these are the maps of from Edward Cook's. You'll notice that the Moll map, the dual hemisphere map of the world, is very similar actually to this John Sennick's map. And the Edward Cook's voyage account has suspiciously good maps, which is something I'm going to look into, but also importantly, it has these tables, as did a lot of these voyage accounts, which is a table of the daily log that tells where the ship was, what the weather was like, what the wind was like, etc. And these tables are going to come up in a future controversy, so I wanted to draw your attention to those. So Rogers' account reveals the extent of Dampier's international reputation, both good and bad. A captured French captain told Rogers that the Spanish were aware that an English privateering fleet was on its way, which they had assumed was commanded by Dampier. Rogers also noted his waning trust in Dampier's skills, as Dampier miscalculated the distance to the Galapagos by over 200 miles. Despite pejorative insinuations, Dampier's status was again underlined when, upon the expedition's return to Amsterdam in July 1711, a British agent wrote to Lord Treasurer Robert Hawley, quote, "Dampier is alive," end quote. When Dampier thought of this final voyage, what Dampier thought of this final voyage is unknown. Perhaps afraid of another print battle which could harm his public image further, or maybe because Rogers and Cook released their accounts too quickly, Dampier did not write an account of the Rogers expedition. Instead, he retired to St. Stephen's Parish, London, where he died in 1715. More than anyone else, Dampier represents the advantages one could gain from sharing Pacific knowledge. He used the geography and natural history of the region as a screen to obscure his buccaneering activities and to gain support of the Royal Society, Admiralty, and merchants. The success of Dampier's works were enduring. Every navigator to the Pacific who followed would study his books. However, his personal reputation was less impervious, especially when faced with rival publications from crewmates. During the 1760s, three separate voyages sought to expand what was known of the Pacific. Byron, followed by Wallis with Carteret, returned to the Pacific to quotidian discourse in Britain, but it was the voyage to observe the transit of Venus from 1768 to 1771 that would bring the region to stellar prominence. As the transit voyage was to have a significant natural philosophical component, the Royal Society suggested Alexander Dalrymple, Fellow of the Royal Society and hydrographer to the East India Company, as commander. The Admiralty refused, however, to issue a commission to a civilian. They had learned from their mistakes with Dampier. Instead, they chose Lieutenant James Cook, who had gained significant hydrographic experience in Newfoundland after the 7 Years' War. The journals of Byron, Wallis, Carteret, and Cook were published together in 1773. The Admiralty, wishing to make the most impact, kept the earlier commanders from publishing at all and demanded that the men turn over all notes and materials from their voyages. This moratorium marks the most sustained engagement of the Royal Navy with the publication of voyage accounts to date. Coordination of the combined account fell to the recently reappointed Lord High Admiral, Lord Sandwich. One of Sandwich's first duties in 1771 was to find someone to edit the work. Sandwich broached the subject with musician and newspaper collector Charles Burney. According to Burney's daughter, Fanny, Sandwich, quote, "should be much obliged to anyone who could recommend a proper person to write the voyage," end quote. Burney suggested Dr. John Hawkesworth, literary editor and writer most known as a member of Samuel Johnson's circle. Having confirmed Hawkesworth's reputation with his friend, the actor David Garrick, Sandwich commissioned Hawkesworth to take on the task. The decision to employ a literary rather than a nautical writer is best explained by the editor of Cook's journals in the 20th century, J.C. Beaglehole, who states, quote, "Literary men wrote the prose of the polite world. Seamen did not," end quote. Whether qualified or not, Hawkesworth took on the task with gusto. Anticipation of the collection's imminent popularity was high, as evidenced by the massive £6,000 advance that Hawkesworth received from publishers William Strahan and Thomas Caddell. An account of the voyage undertaken by order of the present Majesty for making discoveries in the Southern Hemisphere, gotta love those titles, was advertised in early May 1773. Despite last-minute delays due to problems with the engravings, Hawkesworth had seen the collection through to publication in barely 20 months, a monumental feat. On June 9, 1773, the first edition was available to readers in a 3-volume quarto set. Even though the account was priced at a steep 3 guineas, the 2,000-copy first edition sold out immediately, with a 2,500-issue second edition print run released in August. A Dublin and a New York edition appeared in 1773, with French and German editions in the following year. In additions, there were several new charts and a general chart of the world, which you can see here. I do apologize, it's so light. This map is always this light, actually. And it shows the Pacific specifically, so it's a general chart of the Pacific. And you can see that we've had a stylistic switch, especially in the cartouche, away from embellishment to this more unframed but still scrolling type, which is particularly difficult to read on a screen. So Cook was a dedicated and careful hydrographer, not to mention a very skilled one. He taught those skills to all the young officers on his eventual 3 expeditions, including George Vancouver. As examples, the account included plans of the entrance to Botany Bay and the entrance to Endeavour River, both in Australia, as well as a map of Otaheite as it was transliterated at the time, and those are shown here. The account proved popular, but also controversial. Some objected to Hawkesworth writing in the first person, when no one had been on all the vessels. Others took umbrage with his seeming denial of the role of divine providence and the salacious descriptions of Tahitian women. That includes John Wesley, who was quite scandalized by the book. Voyage accounts were expected to inform about geography, about faraway lands and peoples, not to interfere openly in moral battles within Britain, something that Hawkesworth seemed to have misunderstood fundamentally. Whereas the moral and religious objections to Hawkesworth were contentious enough, there was a further line of critique that lambasted not only Hawkesworth, but the Admiralty. In a letter in Baldwin's London Weekly Journal, Novalis, pen name, vented about the process by which the collection was created, arguing that the captains had been cheated in light of the huge sum Hawkesworth received for the work, money better given to the captains or to lowering the price of the book for consumers. Novalis laments that the book diverged from earlier accounts, from, quote, "the plain honest language of our old voyagers," end quote. In a testament to the enduring circulation of those earlier accounts, Novalis asks, quote, "Are not Dampier and Woodes Rogers still read and understood?" End quote. Again, it is clear that Hawkesworth's interpretation of a voyage account was not delivering what was desired by audiences, geographic knowledge presented along with the progress of a ship in time and space. A final category of critique focused on the geographic information shared in the book. The captains had supposedly reviewed and signed off on the work, but Cook denied ever seeing the manuscript. Carteret repeatedly expressed incredulity at the liberties that Hawkesworth had taken with regard to location, chronology, and description. Carteret explained a compulsion to rewrite his own journal, quote, "I find myself under the disagreeable necessity lest my silence should be construed into consent and approbation of publishing it myself, not only in justice to my own character and that of my own voyage should appear together, but for the good of the service and the security of future navigators, that they may have all the observations I made, many of which have been omitted," end quote. Carteret was distressed not only for his own reputation, but because the collection was unusable by other navigators who depended on such accounts to list accurate coordinates and descriptions, not moralized approximations. Another person who agreed that Hawkesworth's presentation of geographic information was flawed was Alexander Dalrymple, the Royal Society's rejected choice of commander. Dalrymple prepared an all-out assault on Hawkesworth's account, which he delivered in the form of a 35-page printed letter, dated June 22nd, 1773, so a month after publication. Amongst personal attacks were focused criticisms of the inclusion of geographic descriptions in the text. Dalrymple next turns to the discrepancies between the charts and the narrative. Ignorance of nautical matters is no excuse for inconsistency, for, quote, a man who presumed to write a book of architecture, when he hardly knew the difference between the pedestal and the capital, would scarcely be excused by pleading his ignorance, end quote. Worse, Hawkesworth committed the sin of substitution, preferring words when views existed which convey, quote, a more exact idea of the appearance of the country than any words possibly can, end quote. Dalrymple fumed. Quote, I will take upon me to say that no man can lay down a tolerable chart, even of the ship's track, from all the nautical observations you have inserted. Had you reduced the logs at sea to daily tables, as Dampier and other navigators have done, very few pages would have shown the courses, winds, weathers, signs of land, and other circumstances for the information of navigators, who at present must be entirely disappointed, and also been satisfactory to such of our readers as take up your book for amusement, or instruction of a different kind, who at present erroneously suppose what is so disagreeable to them must be useful to the navigator, end quote. Dalrymple recognizes that different readers come to a voyage account hoping to gain various experiences. However, those that would use this book for navigation, and even those who enjoy charting the voyages as they read, would be entirely disappointed in this case. In trying to appeal to a general audience, Hawkesworth had snubbed more specialized readers. He also insulted the general audience by underestimating their tolerance of a few extra crucial pages of text. Like Carteret, Dalrymple felt that Hawkesworth had misunderstood the task he had been set in creating a voyage account, to convey useful information that could both amuse and instruct, speaking to multiple audiences at once. While Dalrymple openly criticized the amount of geographic information included in the text, he and others had little to disdain when it came to the charts themselves. The most famous map to be included in the first edition was Cook's most vaunted map of New Zealand, which continued to be referenced and used until the early 20th century. The manuscript presentation chart is today held in the British Library, and then this is the printed version that was included with the text and also issued separately. Cook gathered the information for the map with a running survey and drafted it with the help of Isaac Smith. Cook wrote of the map in his journal, quote, an entry which was included in the published account. Quote, the chart which I have drawn will best point out the figure and extent of these islands. Beginning at Cape Palliser and proceed around Aheinomoi, the North Island, by the East Cape and Co. The coast between these two capes I believe to be laid down pretty accurate, both in its figure and the course and distance from point to point. The opportunities I had and the methods I made use on to obtain these requisites were such as could hardly admit of an error. Some few places, however, must be expected, and these are very doubtful. End quote. The map is remarkably detailed based on a single survey, although there are of course omissions, as Cook intimated. For example, the portion of coastline near Banks Island is but a dotted line because Lieutenant Gore had thought he sighted land to the southeast. Upon sailing toward it, the promontory proved to be clouds. Despite such issues, the map was celebrated and immediately embraced by navigators and integrated by other mapmakers. It was later adopted and adapted by the Hydrographic Office, Britain's first centralized cartographic repository, founded in 1795. The high standard of hydrographic skill would be continued on Cook's 3 voyages, thanks in large part to those Cook trained himself. George Vancouver sailed with Cook on his 2nd and 3rd voyages to the Antarctic Circle and the Pacific Northwest, respectively. Cook had been trained on that 3rd expedition, had been tasked on that 3rd expedition with seeking out the Northwest Passage. He did rule out an ocean-going passage and encountered Hawaii, where he died, but did not have time to explore the numerous inlets and rivers sighted during the expedition. Coincident with the need to exhibit naval power on the northwest coast due to disagreements with the Spanish, the Admiralty ordered the Discovery, with the Chatham in consort, on a surveying expedition to seek out any likely routes for an inland waterway across North America. Vancouver was selected to command the voyage, thanks to his accomplished hydrographic work with Cook and later while serving in the Caribbean. Vancouver departed Falmouth on 1st April 1791, something he wrote about extensively, he thought it was a joke, and sailed round the Cape of Good Hope. He cruised along the southwest coast of Australia, where he named King George Sound. During a visit to New Zealand, he made minor improvements on Cook's map near Dusky Sound. On his working charts, Cook had written, quote, "nobody knows what," end quote, on a small inlet. Vancouver, in his own chart, wrote "somebody knows what." This was characteristic of the expedition, painstaking survey work to fill in the still unknown pockets of Pacific coastline. For 3 years, Vancouver wintered in Hawaii and spent the summer in small boat expeditions. Neither ship had proved fit for survey work, which is kind of a big oversight, charting every curve and twist of the Pacific Northwest over 30 degrees of latitude. The work was exhaustive and exhausting, often causing Vancouver's temper to fray and explaining the complaints of some of his officers and men. After 4.5 years at sea, Vancouver returned to England, an episode with which this talk began. For the next 3.5 years, Vancouver toiled on his voyage account. This proved tough going. First, the Admiralty made clear upon his return that the journals and charts were, quote, "for public information," end quote, yet the higher echelons of the Navy were stingy with funds for the publication. Second, and more alarmingly, prior to departing, Vancouver had angered the naturalist aristocrat Joseph Banks, the famous supernumerary on Cook's first voyage. Banks was an exploration kingmaker by the 1790s, and not someone a naval officer could afford to alienate. Part of the disagreement stemmed from the presence of Archibald Menzies, the naturalist on the Discovery. Vancouver objected to Menzies' request to also be the surgeon on the voyage, preferring his own candidate, Alexander Cranston, although Menzies would come to fill that role anyway due to the incapacitation of Cranston at sea. Vancouver, like Cook before him, was incensed by the addition of a greenhouse to his quarterdeck for botanical samples. The removal of a similar structure had led Banks to quit Cook's second voyage. Vancouver, who had less clout in the Royal Navy than he would like to admit, and certainly less clout than the civilian Banks, had to endure the greenhouse, which ultimately failed on the homeward stretch of the voyage. Banks had ordered Menzies to keep a journal, which was to be delivered to the Home Secretary upon his return. This caused a further problem. When the Discovery returned to England, Menzies refused to turn over his journal with the other officers, as was by then required by the Admiralty. Banks, who carried a grudge, decided to undermine Vancouver's official journal with that of Menzies, an extraordinary step considering that Banks had respected the increasingly streamlined publication process to this point. Indeed, he helped to make it. Instead, Banks badgered Menzies to hurry his journal to publication. Although superseding Vancouver's account to press, quote, "is what I most ardently wish for more reasons than one," end quote, Menzies was also a self-admitted, quote, "slow hand at the pen," end quote, and his sluggish process was eclipsed by Vancouver's more diligent and efficient editing. Most of the text was already set in type when Vancouver died in May 1798. His brother, John, finished the final details posthumously. One thing Vancouver always had that Menzies did not were the maps and charts from the expedition, a major advantage in a market that had come to expect the inclusion of maps and charts with voyage accounts. While on ship, rough sketches from all of Vancouver's officers were consolidated and transferred to a master chart, which was then redrawn and engraved when the Discovery returned to England. Both the transferal to the master chart and the preparation of the final printed works were overseen by Joseph Baker, Vancouver's third lieutenant. However, this work was conducted under Vancouver's exacting eye, both on ship and on shore. As his brother John writes in his advertisement from the editor, quote, "Captain Vancouver had finished a laborious examination of the impression and had compared it with the engraved charts and headlands of his discoveries, from the commencement of his survey in the year 1791 to the conclusion of it at the port of Valparaiso." The fruits of this labor were born in the folio atlas that accompanied the 3/4 volumes of the text, which features 10 folding charts and 6 plates of profiles. There is also a general chart included with the text volumes. This is the first time that we have seen the charts of an Admiralty voyage presented as a separate atlas, a practice that was experimented with in the second and third Cook voyage accounts. This is also a departure in the style of the charts themselves, as you can see here. Their large size and the generous insets mark them as intended for navigational use and consultation primarily. They are far from the illustrative maps of Dampier or the celebratory cartouches from Narborough's maps, although a land-based reader could also conceivably appreciate their painstaking detail and rendering. This contribution to geography was certainly what John Vancouver considered as his brother's most important legacy. Quote, "Notwithstanding that it is pleased the divine providence to spare his life until he had been able to revise and complete the account of the geographical part of his late voyage of discovery, a circumstance which must ever be regarded as most fortunate by all the friends of science, and especially by those professional persons who may hereafter be likely to follow him, through the intricate labyrinth which he has so minutely explored, yet it will ever be a consideration of much regret that he did not survive to perfect the narrative of his labors." End quote. To conclude, what then can we infer from this whistle-stop tour of Pacific voyage accounts? I would like to answer that question with regard to three interrelated issues presented by these case studies: authorship and authority, audience, and format. First, in terms of authorship, the voyage commander, while almost always associated with the corresponding account, was not its sole author. Narborough certainly wrote the log upon which an account of several late voyages was based, but it was edited extensively for publication and framed by a lengthy editorial introduction by Tancred Robinson. Narborough's maps also went through several rounds of editing and repackaging. Dampier's rose to fame because of his writing skills, and surviving manuscripts show that he did edit his own work for press, but he could not always control that narrative for every voyage, as shown with the responses and works of Funnell, Welb, Cook, and Rogers. However, tarnished as his reputation as a commander may have been, his general standing as a navigator gained him an additional circumnavigation, even the diminished role of pilot as opposed to captain, and that standing was forged through his profile in print. Cook did not edit the first voyage for publication, although he did do so with assistance for the second and third voyages. Vancouver too had support, from his brother at least, as well as from those who helped prepare the charts. The printer and publisher would also have made changes that are harder to track, as few business archives of these establishments survive. The voyage account is a compilation of primary documents, memories, and labor from a variety of people. This variety is elided not only by the production process, but by our 19th century conception of a voyage account as a single authored object written by the explorer, with a capital T and a capital E. As these examples show, that single author facade is just that, a front, but also that it is the result of a long process of trial and error on the part of those who sought to bring these voyages to a public readership. While the Admiralty sponsored all of the voyages discussed here, the Royal Navy was a fickle patron when it came to publication. With Narborough, the benefits of a printed account were not seen at the time, due in part to the lukewarm achievements of the voyage. The Royal Society, however, 30 years on, saw Narborough's journal and maps as valuable texts to fulfill their own intellectual agenda. The Royal Society would continue to insinuate itself in the planning and execution of voyages, as seen with the transit expedition, but they did not participate in publication directly after Narborough until the influence of Joseph Banks, who was also a long-standing president of the Royal Society. Dampier's case is inverted. His printed works, with their recognizable Herman Mole maps, caught the attention of the Admiralty, who was not at all involved in his later publications and did not desire to be. After Dampier, however, the Royal Navy caught on to the importance of controlling their public image, specifically in the role published accounts could play in promoting an enterprising, rational, and organized institution. Although never on par with combat, exploration offered the Royal Navy another avenue by which to promote their profile as the defender of the empire. They had learned to harness exploration in print by the late 18th century, but the precise formula for producing a voyage account was still in flux in the time of Vancouver. Publishing was not only about profit or fame, both of which were rare and usually fleeting. It was also about the belief that a wider audience was necessary and qualified to referee the conferral of authority about complex concepts. As the Pacific print wars of Dampier and Welb and Funnell and Dalrymple and Hawkesworth show, a reading audience was also thought sufficiently schooled to be the jury in disputes about reputation which rested on the interpretation of Pacific space. One of the challenges that conditioned the reception of a voyage account was its ability to have two faces. It at once needed to capture the attention of a general readership, thus necessitating an avoidance of nautical jargon, but also to speak to a specialized audience of navigators who might use the text and the all-important charts practically. The separation of Vancouver's charts in an atlas, while the 3 volumes of text were populated with general charts and illustrations, suggests that, by the end of the 18th century, a diversification of voyage publications was occurring. Literacy rates, book ownership, and borrowing were sufficiently developed for publishers to risk the publication of specialized texts in niche topics, such as an atlas of high-resolution charts. Patrons did not need to buy the atlas volume. Indeed, many surviving copies do not have the atlas at all, just the 3 volumes of text. Conversely, sailors could buy only the atlas and charts. The format of the voyage accounts from these expeditions is also indicative of specialization. Octavo sizes were preferred towards the beginning of the century, as they would be more transportable for specialists and cheaper for the general reader. Maps and charts would be tipped into the work, including those intended as illustrations and those used as guides for navigators. From mid-century, however, a preference emerged for more upscale quarto editions with numerous engravings sold alongside cheaper octavo editions that would limit the number of charts and illustrations that could be included. The advent of the folio atlas accompanying the lavish quarto texts signals another sort of differentiation, separating prospective readers by class as well as by intended use. While more and more books included maps as illustrations, end papers, and reference materials, fewer works were produced that included charts intended for use at sea. There had long been maps intended to orient a reader, such as the world map at the beginning of a text, that were included alongside maps intended to orient the navigator, such as plans of bays and ports. Over time, however, it made less and less sense to include these in the same text, again underlying a fissure in the use of the object by readers. This paper has examined voyage accounts and the maps and charts which formed an integral part of them as complex compilations prepared with a multifaceted audience in mind. Over time, this audience split. Correspondingly, the format of the works evolved. While more research is certainly needed to link the publications of Cook and Vancouver to the emergence of the Hydrographic Office and the streamlined publication pipeline of the 19th century, it is possible to grasp the importance of the long 18th century's experimentation with format, audience, and content to the integration of the Pacific into the British printscape. Thank you.
Wow, that was wonderful, Katie. You set yourself an extraordinary challenge, it seemed to me, at the start, to pull together the histories of 4 categories of things that are often treated separately. You know, the book, what was it now? The book, the ship, the chart, and the map. And you pulled it off.
Thanks.
Well done. That was really great. We have 6 minutes for questions, so we may have to rattle through them. First of all, we have something in the Q&A from Mike Barrett. Katie, you mentioned that the Admiralty saw the account of Vancouver's voyage as, quote, for public benefit. Do you have any evidence of, quote, security concerns related to this or to the earlier voyages, which in Portugal, for example, led to strict control of hydrographic data? Vancouver's published voyages were exploited, for example, by Captain David Porter of the US Navy in the War of 1812.
Mm-hmm. Great question.
I mean, that's just an example, I think.
No, so Vancouver is new to me. I'm just starting to work on him and finding him very interesting, kind of crotchety. But I don't actually see that with any of the earlier accounts, and nor do I see it with Vancouver. And I think that's actually very important to contrast Britain to its European enemies and allies, depending which war we're in, because Britain is quite late to the Pacific. And so they don't see the need to make a lot of this information secret because indeed the Spanish already have it. Indeed, Spanish diplomats would read these accounts as they came out and then have private audiences with British diplomats and bring the books with them. We have sources explaining this. They would bring the books with them, cite the page, like chapter and verse of which they objected to and said, we have maps in archive that already show that island. So you can't claim it, it's not yours. And then to which the British diplomats would say, show us the evidence. And then the Spanish are stalled. They're not going to show that evidence because they've been keeping it secret for hundreds of years. And yet by the end of the 18th century, this British method of actually publishing knowledge to make your claims more valid is what is going to win out. I'm sure there are very minute points in terms of certain inlets that they did keep secret, but I don't even see that with Vancouver, for example, if they found an inlet that was particularly interesting for the Northwest Passage, they don't keep that a secret and they don't keep that out, whereas the Hudson's Bay Company would do something like that. So it's the British government is different than its rivals in that sense, certainly in the period prior to the first Cook voyage. And as I'm finding moving into the later period, that seems to be their methodology as well. They'd rather have it on an open market because they trust, I believe, in the power and skill of the Royal Navy to be able to exploit this information much better than any other naval force in the world.
Okay, I better jump in because we have lots of questions and very little time. So in the chat, Agnès asks 2 questions. Was the role of Senex in publishing and promoting Pacific literature as important as it was for North America? And when was made known that Dampier was the first to circumnavigate the world 3 times? Was there any sort of competition or record logging at the time? Was it a kind of race to get round 3 times?
Sure, those are Senex, no, not as important. This is the only one he does as far as I know. It's kind of strange he does it, which is why I want to look into Cook a bit more, Cook with an E. And then the second question, no, they weren't really keeping log at the time. I think this is something realized by one of Dampier's biographers after the fact, and they trumpeted it for him because he has a weird set of fans. And indeed, the first circumnavigation is accidental. It takes 12 years and about 4 or 5 separate voyages and ships because they keep sinking. So no, it wasn't an intentional part. It wasn't something he set out to do on his own part. It's just the only way he knew how to make money.
Okay, and as a reward, Agnès says that I can take some more time if we need it for the question. So I'll thank you for that, and Agnès, and move on to a question from Isabella Alexander, who says this is related to Michael's question in the Q&A. I think you talk about the Admiralty wishing to make information about the voyages public for various reasons, self-promotion, etc. Yet they weren't prepared to become directly involved and left the publication to private enterprise. How do you explain that? Also, should we be surprised that the Admiralty didn't want to keep this information secret? Well, it is indeed related to my keep this information secret for strategic purposes. Is that surprising?
I found it surprising. That's actually why I started to study this way back when, because I thought it was strange that they wanted all of this out there. The more and more I look into it, the more and more it's clear they do want all the information out there. But to talk about, read the first part of the question again. I got all confused in my mind.
I'm sorry, yeah, I was interjected too much. You talk about the Admiralty wishing to make information about the voyages public for various reasons, yet they weren't prepared to become directly involved and left it to private publication.
Right, private enterprise. Got it.
That's interesting. That's a very French question to Britain, isn't it? I would say, but you see what you think.
It is, although it's from an Australian. So no, I think the private business part is fascinating. And again, that's why I got involved in this topic, because the British are so different from the way in which cartography, but also specifically Pacific cartography, are published. And that has to do, I think, with a fear of British military, and there I'm lumping the army in as well, from interfering too much, too broadly across society. They had a lot of influence, but you don't necessarily see the Navy or the Army trying to interact as a business or a private enterprise. They see themselves as a national and a public institution throughout. And we need to remember that one of the other weird things about Britain, they don't have a hydrographic office until 1795. That is so late to leave all of your charting and all of the, they can't, I actually checked this with Megan Barford, who is the authority on it. They aren't actually supplying their own charts to ships until roughly 1809, because it takes them a while to get going at the hydrographic office, for which you can blame Alexander Dalrymple. And so Britain is so late to all of this. And I think a lot of that is because they had created this very unique geographic knowledge community that in my larger work I explained consists of savants in the Royal Society, the Royal Navy and the government officials who are overlapped, and private enterprise. And they trusted and used this private industry and expected them to provide them with charts, voyage descriptions, and maps that were of sufficient quality that their military could depend on them. That was the expectation for the way in which they would have been made. And so the really onus was put on private industry and producers to be supportive parts of the creation of the British Empire, which is different than what I've seen in other empires, particularly the Spanish, which overall didn't really trust private industry as much as the British seem to have.
That relates to a question I had. I was going to suppress it because there's so many questions, but it's so relevant because I wondered whether there's any discussion at all about this private provision by the navigators of the charts. That's to say, they're not regarded as ship equipment. They're regarded as something like in the way that the instruments were. So you bring your own navigation instruments and you bring your, and that's interesting as well for people interested in the history of the charts, because they're seen on a par with, and something like an instrument. They're a kind of instrument, an instrument. Yeah. So
they're absolutely. Yeah, they're absolutely instruments. Absolutely instruments to be used. The charts themselves, and if they're going to be used to add to and to write on and things like that, but also the books themselves. They're not just for entertaining reading. They are being used to check things. They are used to be checked against. Dampier especially is constantly quoted in later journals saying, well, Dampier said this and I see this. The Anson account is great for this. He quotes a bunch of previous both Spanish and English sailors. So I actually think, this is just a hunch, I think it's actually the instruments that lead to the centralization. So by the time of the 1760s expeditions, you do have trials of chronometers and a few other instrument types that are happening. Those are at least worked through the Admiralty itself. They're not necessarily just coming from private industry. And I think there's a realization with the instruments that then spreads to the charts, which are also seen as instruments, that perhaps these actually should come from a centralized authority so that we can have some quality control, rather than trusting in the gentlemanly scrutiny of our officers, which had been the method before.
Very good. I think you're dead right that the chronometers are the pivotal element there. Louise McCarthy says that she's read Hawksmoor's volumes, read that they were very successful among the general public, borrowed about 200 times in the Bristol Library between 1773 and 84. Were sketches, maps also printed outside the book, as they were for as you pointed out, for the later official Cook thing? If so, how widely did they circulate, and how successful were they among non-specialists?
Indeed. So there, I think there's a lot of diminishing returns on the images. So a lot of the images are for specialist use, and they are only going to be issued with the larger quarto editions. With the Anson volume, which I didn't talk about because some people here have heard me talk about him too much, that would be the 1st, 5th, 9th, and 12th editions end up being the larger quarto with the full 48, I believe, prints and engravings and the maps and charts. Cook is going to be very similar. When an edition is reissued with a larger quarto, it will also be issued with all the plates and engravings, and that would be aimed at one certain type of specialized and richer audience. All the other editions are going to be octavos, which will only have about 3 of the illustrations, of which there'll be the general chart and a couple of the more entertaining views. I think the view of the dancing Tahitian ladies is always included, for example, with the later Cook one. And so you're going to see that based on the format, that's going to dictate how many illustrations you can buy that will actually match it to go into it. Of course, you can buy your own. So you could buy the quarto edition, but also buy the illustrations to the octavo, and you can tip those in. I've seen that happen. So there is some playing you can do, because you would have bought them separately and then have them bound. By and large, sometimes they were already bound in, depending on the bookseller. So there is wider circulation of those, I'm not sure of the exact Bristol copy. I had that actually in there and I cut it out. That little tidbit is the most borrowed book from the Bristol Lending Library for the years that records exist from. And that would have been the quarto edition, I'm pretty sure. But yes, the illustrations do also illustrate, but in a very idiosyncratic way, which is why for this kind of research, I really like to do census work and look at as many of the surviving examples as I can with a close look at the collation of how the illustrations and maps are actually included or excluded, which isn't a perfect way to do this, but it's dealing with the surviving sources and seeing what they can offer, basically.
That's great. Thank you so much. Louise? Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Thanks. Katherine, I see that you're suggesting that Ladan and someone else, and Ladan should ask a question herself. Have we changed, or is that just? Should I read it? I'll read it, shall I? Since I've read all the others. Okay. So this is from Ladan. Do you see a parallel or connection between the fissure of readership that you finished with and the specialization of collections in the logic of constitution of museums in the same period? Sorry, collections of in the logic of constitution of museums in the same period.
I do in that another specialization of these books that I didn't want to get into too much, even though I did talk about Joseph Banks a tiny bit, is that alongside these more specialized charts and those kind of publications with the more general readership for a popular audience, there's also going to be an increase in the number of these voyage accounts that are written by the naturalists themselves. And that's going to be almost a third amount. So if you wanted it's a choose your own adventure at this point. If you want the adventure, you get this one in the octavo edition. If you want what the naturalists say, you get the larger, those would also have folio sized illustrations, or at least quarto sized, and they would be quite nice plates and much more expensive, to the point where Banks never actually publishes his because he never gets the engravings right the way he wants them to be. And then you would have the charts as well, which then eventually will slim down to just an atlas. So just a book of charts, not with much of the text taken away, which is an interesting shift in the way also that sailing and navigating is happening over time, that it shifts to instruments and charts as a way and away from the description that we heard talked about by Yoka yesterday with the text. And then I think an important thing to remember is that most of the collections for these early museums, particularly the British Museum, are going to be founded on specifically Pacific collections. A large amount of the earliest ethnographic collections are going to be brought back by Cook, by La Perouse, by Baudin, even though Baudin dies. But by these large state-sponsored expeditions, they're going to be the very bedrock of these early museum collections. So I do think that they're intimately tied together. This idea of we have too much knowledge out there, but we've organized it within an Enlightenment rationality framework. And so now you get to choose your stream of expertise as you go forward. And that's going to be complicated even further by Humboldt when we get into the 19th century, and of course Darwin.
Too much knowledge there, Katie, for you to give short answers. You've got too much knowledge yourself, so it's impossible. So anyway, sorry. There's lots of lovely things in the comments as well as the questions, which I'm skipping over because you can read them later. But a last question. This is the last question. I hope we've still got time for a quick answer from Matthew Edney. There's an element of private ownership of official, in quotation marks, data, as when James Cook was permitted to publish his maps of Newfoundland as a practice of patronage. How does this change in the late 18th century Vancouver and Dalrymple query?
That is something I'm still looking at with Vancouver. Yeah, the Vancouver, not such an issue because he does die. I think we see more of an issue of it earlier as well with something like Sidney Parkinson's illicit pirated, well, not pirated, but his brother, he also died on the expedition. But his brother publishes before the Hawkesworth one, and then that is suppressed afterwards. So they were told they could keep those items upon which his brother based it, and then afterwards the Admiralty combined with Hawkesworth bring a suit and they're able to stall that publication further. So I think there is that happening a little bit earlier on. With Dalrymple, because he's working for the East India Company, we see a lot of private publication happening. So there's a lot of his own self-aggrandizement, as we see also with his the collection of voyages in search of the southern continent, which he releases in right as the Cook expeditions comes back, and in a hope that he can benefit from that personally. So Dalrymple, I especially see that public-private shading going on that's much more similar to the hydrographers of the Dutch East India Company earlier, in the way they're benefiting personally as well as benefiting the company. And I think that's actually going to be some of the early friction and issues at the hydrographic office when it's finally up, is that Dalrymple is unclear precisely the role of that office, whether it be repository, whether it be a clearinghouse and that's going to be selling things for profit, or whether they should have specialized items intended only for sailors. So I think all of those things come back together that way.
Okay, great. You coped brilliantly with questions, and thank you all for your wonderful questions, and thanks for a great session all around. Do I hand over now to the organizers for any business? Because we've got 5 minutes now until the book club, haven't we?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Katie.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Katie, for your wonderful talk. So yes, I'm going to announce the break. The conference will start again at 2 p.m. with the fourth panel. In the meantime, as Jim said, you will be able to attend the book club animated by Ludan. So stay tuned in if you want to have news from the publications of the members of the society. So see you at 2 p.m. So now Stephen will introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Corinne, and hello from the coast of Maine. I'd like to welcome you all, wherever you are, to this session on surveying the empire, a topic that was well broached in Max Adelson's keynote lecture yesterday. And it's a topic that has interested scholars for the past couple of decades. Before I introduce our first speaker, just to reiterate that the Q&A follows after all 4 papers. Our first speaker is Christopher Ray, who, glad to see, is on screen there. He is a Leverhulme Trust lecturer in Indigenous America at the University of Hull in the UK. His research focuses on the early American Indian experience, Indigenous European interaction in the Trans-Appalachian West, and in the European construction of Indigenous slave law. He is the author and editor of several books and chapters, and has a book forthcoming entitled Cherokees, Europeans, and Empire in the Trans-Appalachian West, 1670 to 1774. His talk today is entitled Native Cartography and the Limits of European Empire in 18th Century North America. Over to you, Christopher.
Okay, thank you very much. One quick disclaimer here, I guess. While I find my PowerPoint, I don't know why it's not showing up here. Oh, there we go. No, there. But the wonders of the pandemic are such that I'm having to do this presentation from home, and next door they just decided to begin power washing the walls. So if it suddenly gets really very loud, I'm very sorry. I wish I could control that. Okay, and just to get started here, this is basically just a very brief excerpt or a small bit out of the broader project that I'm just now completing on Cherokees, Europeans, and Empire. And I know there's not going to be enough time to chat about all of it, but if you're interested, don't hesitate to let me know afterwards, via email or what have you. I'm happy to chat further. Okay. In 1723, a Lower Chickasaw man called Fanny Mingo, translated as Squirrel King, delivered a very interesting map to British officials in Charlestown, South Carolina. It was on deerskin, and the original is lost to history. Fortunately, 2 years after Fanny Mingo handed over this map, a Charlestown clerk made an exact replica, albeit with a few additions. He labeled various things, added a little bit of commentary, but other than the British editions, this is a really good, from all accounts, replica of the original map. As one might expect, this map designates trade paths, lays out riparian systems, and identifies various settlements across the eastern portion of North America. Unlike his European cartographical contemporaries, however, Fanny Mingo was unconcerned with geospatial order and scale. Just by way of explanation, you can compare the Chickasaw map with these two, map on the left being a French map from 1748, the map on the right a British from 1762, all of which are looking at roughly the same space. But you can really get a sense of how the non-Western mind in North America viewed cartographical relationships, which is to say that's what was most interesting to him. Other than geospatial order and scale, Fanny Mingo was most interested in relationships between Southern polities, between native Southerners and indigenous populations in other regions. Particularly notable on this map are four very large circles, which the British subsequently labeled Cherokees, Creeks, Chickasaws, and Choctaws. Seemingly in fixed locations, the size and placement of their spheres suggest centrality and power. Europeans, by contrast, are mostly peripheral. The English have a circle on the edge at Charlestown, but the Spanish, then at Pensacola and St. Augustine, and the French at Mobile and New Orleans, don't rate circles. Closer inspection of the map reveals more than just the peripheral nature of Europeans. It provides insight, for example, into the imperial willingness to generalize. After all, it was the British who gave names to the four major circles 2 years after Fanny Mingo handed over the map. Given that the idea of singular nationhood was an utterly foreign concept, none of these four polities would naturally have accepted the generic labels that the British put upon them. The map also provides evidence of indigenous manipulation. As a Chickasaw, Fanny Mingo would have been very well aware of French Louisiana and Spanish Florida, not to mention New France. And the fact that he leaves these out suggests he's very much playing to his British audience. Perhaps most importantly, by identifying so many native settlements along trade paths in the four major river systems that crisscross the landscape, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Tennessee, and the Wabash, Fanny Mingo opens the door to a more nuanced understanding of the complex and fast-paced mobility defining the 18th century indigenous American experience. So far from living in fixed locations, seemingly awaiting European invasion, Squirrel King reveals an evolving indigenous-centered world wherein Europeans are more accurately on the periphery. In particular, what I want to do now is focus on the Tennessee-Ohio Wabash connection. These three rivers come together in the Ohio Valley and directly connect to the Pays des Illinois, or Illinois country as well, because it's here that we really start to see some very interesting things developing. Put very simply, between 1670 and 1776, Europeans struggled to overcome a dissonance between European or imperial visions as displayed in their cartography of North America and the reality of indigenous mobility, coalescence, and autonomy as suggested in the very rare examples of indigenous cartography, such as the Fanny Mingo map or the map that Max Edelson showed yesterday, the Catawba map. If there's any time at all, I would love to come back around to that one at the end of the conversation, although I don't think there will be time. Before we go any further, I'd like to provide just some quick and crucial context. Fanny Mingo's world was rooted in a mobility that predated European arrival, but which accelerated as a result of the English settlement of Charlestown in 1670. At the heart of this acceleration were two skin trades, one in deer skins and the other in Indian slaves, both of which were abetted by indigenous willingness to procure and sell to English buyers. By the early 18th century, the two trades had a powerful effect on Trans-Appalachian North America, encouraging native Southerners to modify hunting lifeways and serving as the vectors necessary to catalyze demographically catastrophic diseases. They also sparked the process of coalescence, wherein Mississippian chiefdoms collapse, as described by Professor Edelson yesterday, and coalescent societies begin to emerge. And as they did so, these coalescing native Southern populations are raiding and hunting, I should say, increasingly further afield from their areas of coalescence. Chickasaws are perhaps the most well-known example through their raids upon Choctaws and Quapaws. Late 17th and 18th century Cherokees also left an indelible mark on their native counterparts, however, through their systematic extension into the Wabash, Ohio, Tennessee river system. The Chickasaws were commonly observed in this area as well. In 1716, for example, Overhill men traveled the Tennessee River to raid Kaskaskias, in the process killing nearly a dozen Frenchmen. In 1717, only a year later, Cherokee men from the towns of Quanasi and Tellico, those are valley and overhill towns respectively, killed French officers along the Wabash River while searching for, quote, Nottaways, Senecas, Kaskaskias, and Cahokias. When in 1726-27, Carolina officials encouraged Overhill men to slave raid amongst lower Creek towns further in the native South, the Long Warrior of Tennessee instead indicated his desire, quote, to go against the French Indians in the Pays des Illinois, unquote. The Chickasaw-Cherokee movement into and out of the Ohio Valley, into the Wabash Valley, into the Illinois country, that mobility goes in both directions. And it's important, I think, at this point to further explain the reality of indigenous mobility at this moment in early modern North American development. Excursions such as Cherokees and Chickasaws into the Ohio Valley and the Pays des Illinois challenged the polities that were then leaving or coming into the Ohio Valley for the first time themselves. Or moving into different areas of the Ohio Valley themselves. Just by way of example, between the 1650 and the 1680s, we know that Quapaws left the Ohio Valley to settle down the Mississippi River along what's called the Arkansas River today, in the Arkansas River Valley, as at roughly the same time that Quapaws are leaving to go towards the Arkansas River Valley, various Fort Ancient groups leave the Ohio Valley and go to 5 different locations around the Mississippi North American map. Many of them are going to coalesce and come back together in the 18th century as Shawnees. We'll come back to that point here in a moment. At the same time that this is happening, groups that the French called Twitwies, who eventually became known as Miamis, began to leave the Pays des Illinois and move further to the east into the Wabash River Valley and into what today we would call Western Ohio. As the Miamis moved to the east, Kickapoos, Mascoutins, and Piankashaws moved from the west and north into the Pays des Illinois, into areas that the Twitwies were beginning to move away from. At the same time that this was happening, Wendats, also known as Hurons, were regularly observed in the Ohio Valley and Pays des Illinois and Wabash Valley. And the Anishinaabeg, the Odawas, Ojibwas, and Potawatomis also were leaving their Great Lakes, their central location in the Great Lakes region, to reinforce their links to the Pays des Illinois. By the time we get into the early 18th century then, we see Shawnees, Lenapes, also known as Delawares, and Senecas beginning to enter into the upper Ohio Valley. The point here is this is a very fast-paced world in which people are moving and settling and moving. They're not in fixed locations. Maps such as the one we see below here, this is the 1755 Jacques Ballin map, in effect tricks the reader into assuming that various native groups are in fixed locations. They are in these locations, but in many cases they're recent arrivals and they might be moving yet again. Fanny Mingo's map speaks to this. And as the more visible Cherokees and Chickasaws became in this world, the more they complicated the map, so to speak. These encounters between Cherokees and Chickasaws and Wendats and Piankashaws and Mascoutins and Peorias and so forth, these encounters were indigenous driven and they were indigenous focused, but they confused and scared British, French, and Spanish observers who didn't understand what they were seeing. A 1738 report by New France Governor Charles de la Boche, Marquis de Beauharnois, provides an excellent example of this. He expressed frustration that year that Cherokees and Wendats had agreed to a diplomatic arrangement in the Wabash River Valley within the so-called boundaries of New France, but without French input and about which the French knew very little. Much to Beauharnois' puzzlement, this agreement led Anishinaabe on the Great Lakes to send a group of fighters into the Wabash Valley to try to stop the Cherokees before they could go any further back towards the Overhill settlement area. The situation produced still more befuddlement when French observers reported that Wendats were well aware of what the Anishinaabe were up to and got to the departing Cherokees first, in the process helping to coordinate a joint counteroffensive. Confusing? Absolutely, this is confusing. It's incredibly confusing. And it was confusing to contemporary observers as well. Beauharnois feared that such actions and counteractions negatively affected French continental stability, but recognized that there was very little he could do to stop it. The British repeatedly reported very similar scenarios. The records and maps left behind by European observers are framed by their ethnocentrism, of course, but inter-indigenous encounters drove Europeans into spirals of paranoia and conspiracy theory that were compounded by imperial confrontations in the broader Atlantic world. Self-preservation demanded greater attention to native affairs, fundamentally framing imperial North American decision-making on several levels. Fanny Mingo's map, then, is a powerful reminder that European invasion produced forces of tremendous consequence on the continent. But their minimal populations and limited actual reach kept them firmly on the periphery of an indigenous North America in the long 18th century. One more example, this time more trade-centered as I come to a close here. And in particular, I want to connect to this part of the Fanny Mingo map, that's also now called the Chickasaw map. The pictographs that you see here are part of what we would call the Pays des Illinois, or Illinois country, and they're meant to represent a bison and a bison hunter. It reinforces the fact that bison skin trading was a very lucrative business at places the French called Wyatt-Non, Vincennes, Fort Chartres, and the Pays des Illinois. We can also interpret from these pictographs that the Illinois country is a fertile place, a place where there is a lot of opportunity, perhaps. And this fact produced a phenomenon that very few contemporary Europeans understood, with the consequence that modern scholars tend to overlook it as well. While they certainly could and did arrive via formal French, Spanish, or British trade networks, informal inter-indigenous markets for European commodities also developed. Evidence of regional inter-indigenous markets for European goods, in fact, abound. If one looks carefully. Upon encountering Peorias for the first time in 1673, for example, Jacques Marquette observed that they, quote, use guns which they buy from our allies who trade with our French. Only a few decades later, Antoine Denis Radeau observed that people west of the Mississippi River were in regular contact with the Illinois because, quote, having need of their trade to get axes, knives, awls, and other objects, the Illinois buy these things from us to resell to the people on the other side of the Mississippi River. Pierre de Liette offers further telling insight into the point. In 1721, his journal from the Pays des Illinois chronicles an abundant variety of game animals, edible and medicinal flora, lead mines, and other exploitable natural resources. Those things in and of themselves would have been sufficient to bring native polities into the region, regardless of imperial prompting. Yet Liette also describes a striking number of guns, horses, and European commodities, along with brief explanations for how they arrived in the Pays des Illinois and Wabash River Valley to begin with. Like Marquette and Radeau before him, he observes that Illinois polities received horses and Spanish goods from the Pawnees, Osage, and others in the West. Meanwhile, they received French commodities through the Jesuits, voyageurs, and Anishinaabe traveling into the region from the Great Lakes, which, as per Rideau, they in turn traded in multiple directions on the compass. Scholars can add that over the course of the 18th century, British supplies entered the region via the Ohio Valley and Carolina. And that hardly begins to explain the curious emergence of horse markets observed by Carolinians, Georgians, Virginians, the French, the Spanish, and after 1776, Americans around the periphery of the native South. Hubris notwithstanding, Europeans seemed only indirectly necessary for the growth and sophistication of markets for European goods. Standard historiographical narratives then, in which native polities played European powers to maximize their, or played off European powers to maximize their declining geopolitical circumstances, cede too much power to Western ideas of empire, jurisdictional control, and indigenous nationhood. By focusing on native Trans-Appalachia, Fanny Mingo's map reminds us that native polities reshaped their world based on inter-indigenous interactions and practices, and that they exerted as much or more pressure on European America than vice versa. Europeans misinterpreted political and diplomatic cues in an attempt to overcome the limited practical reach of their imagined empires, and the North American historical narrative has suffered as a result. Perhaps then it is time to use tools like the Fanny Mingo map to decolonize the American historical narrative. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Christopher, for a paper that develops beautifully from Max's presentation yesterday. The third speaker is Bayanti Chatterjee, who is an assistant professor at the University of Calcutta. Her area of research is early colonial Bengal, and she has published on ecology and imperium, state formation in early Bengal, 1765 to 1800, and other articles on the environment, trade, and society in the 18th century. Her talk today is Founding Empire, James Rennell and the 18th Century Survey of Bengal, by Bayanti.
Thank you, sir, for the kind introduction. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Is the presentation visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now I'll start with the general assumption among scholars that cartography and surveying were essentially Western innovation introduced into India with colonial expansion. It has been argued that in the ancient Indian languages, there was no contemporary equivalent for the English word map, and map making was therefore either covered by the word chitra or painting, or it did not exist at all. Scholars like Leo Bagro have expressed the view that India had no cartography to speak of, since religious and caste-bound disputes inhibited the growth of empirical knowledge in the subcontinent. Refuting Bagro's views, other scholars have opined that the notion of the absence of cartography in the South Asian context rests on a too narrow definition of maps. Brian Harley points out that that geographical maps are but one aspect of a wider discourse of maps, which extends to embrace other genres such as cosmological and celestial representations, as well as maps of fictional areas. Schwartzberg argues that cartographic works that did not resemble known European models elicited little or no interest from Western scholars and were viewed as beyond the pale of cartographic research. This was particularly the case with Indian cosmographies. So I have here an example of a cosmographical mapping where the world is conceptualized as a tortoise, its face facing the east, and the west, the tail. But I would argue in this paper that geographical mapping in the sense of geography, was also not unknown in the Indian subcontinent. In the Mughal era, detailed inventories of territorial possessions were maintained as demonstrated in Abul Fazl's account of the 12 subas in the Imperial Gazetteer, Ani Akbari. It was basing on Ani Akbari that Colonel Jean-Baptiste Joseph Gentil prepared his Atlas of India, from which this is an illustration of the map of Bengal in 1770. So Kapil Raj has therefore argued that far from being a geographical tabula rasa, terrestrial surveying, measuring, and representation were very much common in South Asia. I would argue in this paper that what was unique about the colonial encounter was the large-scale utilization of maps and surveys as tools for empire and imperial expansion. In Europe, the rise of bureaucratic states and modern scientific practices during the Enlightenment era resulted in the proliferation of maps between 1650 to 1800. The creation of the new kinds of map during this period, as Edney and Spongberg argue, indicated that producers and consumers of maps shared in the great intellectual and social changes that were then transforming Europe. Maps were utilized for nationalist ends as cartography became associated with the assertion of national unity at the cost of internal diversity and for the purpose of declaration of a state's territorial interest vis-a-vis another. But some of the most important cartographic developments were to take place in areas away from the main population centers of Northwestern Europe, in regions where there were fewer restraints. Surveys became particularly crucial to governments in the newly established European colonies. As Matthew Edney very pithily puts it, to govern territories, one must know them. This paper argues that the East India Company's territorial expansion and consolidation of its political authority in Bengal was sustained and bolstered by extensive surveys and mapping of a newly acquired and uncharted territory. In this sense, the mid-18th century colonial transition could perhaps be characterized as a cartographic watershed. Although 16th century Europe had seen some significant manuscript narratives of India from Portuguese and Spanish writers, yet until the 18th century, geographical knowledge regarding India was largely based on tradition and tales of mariners and travelers who borrowed from one another, their narration acquiring variation and detail as fancy directed. It was political conquest that first created the opportunity for a large-scale or extensive surveying of Indian territories. In the mid-18th century, the political situation in Bengal alone was favorable for an extensive survey. While imperialism created the ideal conditions for accumulation of geographical knowledge, surveys and cartographic knowledge in its turn helped cement imperial power. This paper likes to look at this reciprocal relationship between surveys, mapping, and cartography. In the domain of statecraft, postmodernist thought has viewed maps as instruments of power and knowledge and emphasized on the profitability of the geographical discourse for apparatuses of power. Harley says that the surveyor is just like the historian. As a historian paints the landscape of the past in the colors of the present, the surveyor replicates not just the environment in some abstract sense, but the territorial imperatives of a particular political system. Maps are therefore conceptualized by Harley as weapons of imperialism as much as guns and warships. In the Foucauldian sense, surveys and mapping could very well be conceptualized as a form of surveillance by the state. Building on this postmodernist scholarship of maps and geographical knowledge as instruments of power, the paper focuses on colonial cartography as the handmaiden of imperial expansion in the 18th century. Now, a major reason for the proliferation of maps on Indian geography in the mid-18th century was the fact that India had been transformed into a theater of war between the French and the English East India companies. D'Anville, the French cartographer, in a preface to his work, acknowledged that he would have never drawn the map of India had not His Majesty's commissaries of the East India Company drawn me the honor to request it. Although D'Anville admits to the limitations of his map of India and hopes that it may prove the groundwork of another more accurate and complete one, yet with regard to Bengal, D'Anville's major contribution was filling up a vacant space in the map from Hooghly to the sea. Accurate charts of the Bengal coast were also obtained from the survey of French navigator Manvillet, who published his maritime atlas Neptune Orientale in 1745. Despite the Anglo-French rivalry over the future of the Indian Empire, at an international level, Anglo-French information flows continued in both ways. Renel benefited from the works of French cartographers like D'Anville, and his own work was translated into French and published in Paris. Now, with the political conquest of the English East India Company and territorial acquisitions in Bengal, surveys of the company's new dominions were requested from London. But there was a lack of skilled and enterprising surveyors experienced in terrestrial surveying. The government had applied to one Admiral Watson, but the latter replied that as surveying was work requiring much care and exactness, he did not know anyone in the squadron capable of it. Eventually, a Mr. Franklin was appointed, who made a 5 months survey tour in which he collected much valuable information. Now, these early British surveys were far from being accurate or thoroughly complete. The East India Company's parsimony in fetching good surveying instruments continued to plague the company's surveyors. Equipments for a government expedition in the late 18th century could be procured only by borrowing a sextant here, a watch there, and perhaps a quadrant in another quarter. Markham mentions an instance where Reuben Barrow, in starting upon a government survey, had to borrow his tools and complained that among them was a wretched quadrant from Captain Ritchie. This was described by Markham as an instrument that Bruce took with him to Abyssinia, which it required 4 men to carry. Colonel Hudson, during his survey, also had instruments and books of his own to the value of 13,000 and nothing belonging to government. Another source of cartographic error before Renel's time was the fact that the longitude of a place was determined by using the prime meridian of Paris or Greenwich. This practice, according to Professor Irfan Habib, created considerable confusion. Since no longitude could be determined directly in relation to any place in Western Europe, in actual practice, mapmakers accepted degrees of longitude worked out by different observers for the different cities on the basis of assumptions of different longitudes east of the prime meridian in Europe. Professor Habib suggests that if the surveyors had accepted a place in India for fixing the 0-degree longitude, it would have been much easier to determine longitudes of places in relation to the place on the prime meridian. For his Bengal atlas, Renel, however, took as his prime meridian the longitude of Calcutta, which ensured the greater accuracy of his maps. With Renel, the founder of scientific geography in India, therefore begins a new phase in colonial cartography. Sir Edward Thackeray, in his biographical notices of the Royal Bengal Engineers, describes Renel as a unique figure, a calm, disinterested man of science among his eager, fortune-seeking countrymen. Yet Renel himself does not claim to be an objective pursuer of scientific geography, but as surveyor to the company's possessions in India, he himself was an avid supporter of the East India Company's splendid territorial aggrandizement. In his map of Hindustan of 1782, the cartouche depicts the figure of a female Britannia who's accepting the scroll from the Pandits, and there's a figure of the lion dominating the globe. There's British lion dominating the globe. In the background, we see ships sailing, which is asserting British dominance over the seas. Michel Wintel has argued that in mapping the colonized parts of the world, a process of othering and creation of national identity was involved. In India, Britain's cartographic activities in the 18th century not only bolstered imperial administration and control, but they also asserted national identity by imposing order and science on the unruly Indian landscape, replete with symbols of British national identity. Chester further argues that under Renel, the tradition of coloring maps became more than just an aesthetic tradition and took on imperial significance. In 19th and 20th century imperial maps, red was used as a code for British imperial hegemony. According to Chester, Renel may have well begun this tradition of denoting British imperial possessions in red. For all these reasons, the era of James Renel may be distinguished from the period of the early British surveys. Now, Renel's survey work within Bengal could be conveniently divided into hydrographical surveys, route surveys, and the surveys of the frontier tracts. Renel's first task in Bengal was to survey the river Ganges and find a waterway for up-country traffic from Calcutta that would be navigable throughout the year. Renel considered the great rivers of Bengal to be the keys to the geography of the country. It was no accident that the headquarters of the Surveyor General were located at Dhaka, for it was located at a convenient central position from the point of view of the surveyor. Renel found that the Ganga-Brahmaputra rivers, together with their numerous branches and adjuncts, intersected Bengal in such a manner as to form the most complete and easy inland navigation that was most conducive to trade and commerce. Along with his hydrographical surveys, Renel's route surveys in Bengal were equally extensive. These route surveys were distinguished by the fact that their immediate purpose was the survey of the marches of a body of troops rather than the complete survey of a particular area or boundary. On 30th August 1766, Renel writes that he has within this past month formed a map of a part of Bengal for Lord Clive. I imagine Lord Clive will publish it, for the old maps are shocking. In 1767, Renel was appointed the Surveyor General of India with a salary of 300 rupees per month. Warren Hastings, in justifying the high salary granted to Renel, wrote to the Court of the Directors on the risks undertaken by surveyors in venturing into areas previously unexplored, and underscored the significance of surveys both in military operations and in coming at a true knowledge of the value of the company's possessions in India. Now, the third of Renel's contribution was the survey of the frontier tracts. Since the grant of Diwani, the company had been increasingly anxious for the protection of its western frontiers, so that Renel prepared a map of the western jungle terai districts, which was published as early as 1779. These jungle terai districts denoted a low forest land, a tract of low forest land that was considered inaccessible and unknown, and in which the Mughals have never explored or subdued. Renel's map of this region was the most valuable index to the condition of the country in the first years of British administration. Just as the surveyor's contribution was requisitioned in the fluid western frontier, so also in the eastern frontier, Renel services were requested. In 1774, at the request of Richard Barwell, Renel reported on the condition of the Khasi Jaintia territory to the northeast of the district of Sylhet, although it does not seem likely that Renel penetrated very deep into these parts. He describes the Khasi country and its western parts in general as woody and almost impenetrable. The relationship between surveys, mapping, and political authority is most clearly borne out in case of these frontier tracts of Bengal. In these frontier tracts, where surveyors found it difficult to penetrate owing to geographical obstacles, political authority continued to be disrupted. Now, we have already noted that maps and surveys were not essentially new in the Indian subcontinent, but that the value of maps and surveys in establishing political authority was well understood by Indian political powers is evident from the resistance which the East India Company encountered in implementing its first surveys. Between 1770 and 1775, several unsuccessful attempts were made to persuade the Nawab of Carnatic to allow a survey of his territories, but the Nawab every time declined the request on grounds that a survey of his territories would diminish his prestige and dignity and honor in the eyes of the neighboring powers and foreigners. Even though in Bengal, political condition was favorable for extensive surveys, yet the surveyors faced difficulties in gathering information and intelligence from the local populations. In 1774, after completing a series of provincial maps of Bengal, Renner lamented, "I will not pretend to say that every particular part of this map is perfectly accurate, for there is the difficulty of securing intelligence of any kind, as has often happened in places where the natives either through fear desert their habitations or through obstinacy refuse their assistance." There thus remained a wide gap between the ideology and practices of mapping in early colonial India. As Matthew Edney says, there was a multi-layered conflict between the desire and the ability to implement the perfect panopticist survey, between what the British persistently thought they had accomplished and the hybrid cartographic image of India which they actually constructed. Renner retired from service in 1776, shortly after being promoted to the rank of major, with a pension granted to him by Warren Hastings. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society and took up his residence in London. His house became a meeting place for travelers from all parts of the world, and Renner devoted himself to the study of comparative geography and literary pursuits. His Bengal Atlas was the chief publication of his Bengal mapmaking. This was followed by the first approximately correct map of India, with a memoir containing a full account of the plan on which the map was executed and his authorities. The labors of Renner and his school, as Markham observes, were not only useful at the time, but they also served as incitements to encourage a generation of companies, surveyors, and cartographers. From Renner and his 4 assistants in the 18th century sprung up the vast edifice of the Survey of India, which came to employ 150 Europeans besides a large army of native surveyors. Kapil Raj argues that despite the asymmetric relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, scientific activities like surveying and cartography had to be locally negotiated. This resulted in the creation of hybrid forms of knowledge. What this paper has tried to argue is that the colonial context provided a unique opportunity for the creation of new forms of knowledge catering to a changed political context. In his Memoirs of Map of Hindustan, Renner writes, "However surprising it may appear, it is nevertheless true that the first maritime nation in the world has no good chart to direct its fleets towards its own coasts, nor even a criteria by which the public may be enabled to judge of the merit of any hydrographical production whatsoever, so that the soundings on the coast of Bengal are better known than those in the British Channel, of which no tolerable chart exists even at this day." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baijayanti. Can you hear me, Baijayanti?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just subbing for Stephen, who is experiencing a storm right now and had his internet connection shut. So thank you very much, and we're for your fascinating presentation.
I'd like to thank all 4 presenters for their stimulating talks and for also keeping to time, which leaves plenty of time now for questions. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Katherine, who is going to moderate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So we're a little late, but we'll still have plenty of time for questions. So the first question was from Sarah. So theoretically, you should be able to activate your video and your microphone.
I am theoretically activating it, so I hope. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see me? Not that that matters. Yeah, well, could I just congratulate all the speakers? This was a really excellent session, and I realise now, as the last speaker has said, Katherine Porter, many of the themes, in fact, cover all 4 speakers' talks, especially the encounters between the locals, if you like, and the surveyors, Indigenous people and chiefs in Canada, which Michael and I think Christopher were talking about, though I had an internet incident with Christopher, so I apologize for not hearing all of his. And what I really wanted to know was, how far do you think, Michael, that the encounters and the surveying contributions that the locals made to the settler mapping, whether it made any difference in your view to the general mapping of Canada as seen on smaller scales? Michael, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I guess maybe I'll quickly ask a point of clarification. So what exactly do you mean by smaller scales, as in the level of survey, or kind of?
I'm thinking of the topographical, the regional surveys, or even possibly national surveys, which were conducted.
Right.
Mostly from England, I'm sure. But
yeah. So I think that, you know, we see this history less in Upper Canada to a certain extent, much more in places like Hudson's Bay territory, where, you know, these rivers sometimes appear and disappear, and there's all sorts of questions about, you know, what's sort of beyond, particularly westward. That said, I think that there's surprisingly little about mapping in Upper Canada specifically. And I've been looking at some of the smaller maps. I know folks like Jeffers Lennox have done the really heavy legwork of showing how, in the case of kind of what is now Nova Scotia, those encounters really did matter at that larger scale or smaller scale. But I think that it's something that I'd like to direct my work towards. I can certainly say with maps like D.W. Smith's that he published in 1799 and has quite acclaim. I think at one point reviewers refer to as good as any French map, which, you know, he's just absolutely chuffed about. That map is produced in part with the assistance of Indigenous guides and these kinds of encounters. Again, you don't see those on the map. It's when you read the records that you can find that, you know, these interactions are key.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So did he answer your question, or do you have any more comment you would like to make?
Oh, me? Well, no, not really. I think there was a second question coming from somebody about the French contribution. So perhaps that
yes
could speak. Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll now give the floor to Isabelle. The next question was by Isabelle Charon. So, Isabelle, you should be able to activate your video. Isabelle, you wish to ask a question, so maybe we'll
it was a good question.
Move on to the next speaker, next person who wishes to ask a question. It's Robin. So, are you there?
I am.
Yes. Okay. So please ask your questions. You had two questions.
Well, I had two questions. One was to Srimati Banerjee about the way we developed Calcutta as a port, knowing how difficult it is to get up the river. I mean, the Calcutta Boar is renowned. It's an absolute bastard, excuse my expression. But I just wondered what she thought about how we surveyed that and why we wanted to put our base in Calcutta when all our ships had to get up this appalling bore.
Calcutta, most of the trading settlements, not only just of the English East India Company, but all the settlements were along the Hooghly River. And from the 17th century onwards, there were many attempts to chart the shoals. The James and the Mary shoals were reputed for sinking of the two ships and was named. But it provided the most convenient highway for commerce. And then the Hooghly River joined with other adjunct channels. So for navigational purposes, there was no other alternative but to go up the river Hooghly. And so the settlements concentrated, not just of the English East India Company, but the Dutch, the French, and the Danes, the Sherampur, Chandannagore, Calcutta, everything concentrated on the two banks of Hooghly River. It was the most convenient channel, although it was perilous.
Shukriya, Shrimati Banjari.
Okay.
Played it to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And you said you had also another question for another of our panelists, or?
Yes, I did. I was looking at the maps of Northern Ireland. I thought we had a very, very interesting explanation of the mapping. But one thing that interested me was that Derry, Londonderry wasn't shown. I mean, Derry, Londonderry, Dora, as it's now called. But it doesn't show on those early maps. So at what point did the City of London get involved in developing a colony, you might call it, in that area?
Yeah, so actually, I think it's probably because I'm not able to really show the maps properly at scale, but the very first map I showed, the Bartlett map, it does show Derry. It is present there, and it was present on earlier maps of Ireland as well. But as you rightly point out, there was a name change there not long after this particular group of Bodley maps were surveyed and drawn. So yes, we do see a movement with quite a bit of change with the London companies there getting involved, and that being seen or witnessed through the cartography involved in that as well. But yes, you rightly point out it had a different name prior to that. So we see that change happening through the cartography, which is an interesting record for people who are interested in place name research as well as cartographic research as well, of course.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Then Alex had a question also. Alex, if you can activate your video. There is Alex. Yes, thank you.
Hi. My question is for Christopher. You note that the Fanny Mingo map exemplifies the idea that the notion of a singular nationhood was foreign to indigenous peoples. So my question is, did the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creeks at all self-identify as a people, or did they have ways of differentiating themselves from other peoples? And if they did have other ways to identify themselves, did those ways ever show up on the maps they produced?
I about launched in without unmuting myself, which would have made for a wonderful pantomime experience. It's an excellent question. And unfortunately, indigenous drawn maps are extremely rare. A good example of what I'm talking about is the map that Professor Edelson showed yesterday that's called the Catawba map, where in effect what you see is a process of coalescence on the deer skin. In the native South, most commonly the way, at least in terms of political identity, people thought about themselves was in relation to town and region, with very, very careful sinews of clan that connected some towns and even intra-regionally. But town and region with only a very gradual application of a national identity. It's something that the British try to do as early as the 17-teens. They try to shoehorn indigenous groups, Creeks and Cherokees most prominently, but not exclusively, into this idea of a singular nationhood with an emperor or a king at the top. You know, for example, King Hagler of the Catawbas, or Malachi amongst Creeks, or Moitoy amongst Cherokees, where they're the king or the emperor. When the fact of the matter is, these different groups said over and over and over again, that's not how we roll. This is something that we identify locally and regionally. And over time, over the course of the 18th century, you see more and more of a national identity. But even here, it's sort of complicated, because just by way of example, the Cherokee, by the way, is a variation of a Creek term for the Anikatua, the Chalakis. Right, and so it's not even a term that Cherokees called themselves in the 18th century. They were the Anikatua, sometimes called Aniyunwiya, which means the real and true people. But they're Iroquoian speakers. But Overhill Iroquoian is a different dialect from Lower Town Iroquoian, which means that in some cases you even need interpreters in order for Overhill Iroquoian to be understood in the lower towns. And similarly, if you go up to the north to the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee territory, those are different dialects of Iroquoian again. So you've got, you know, again, it creates a situation wherein you don't naturally link towards a singular national identity. It's a gradual process over a course of time. But if you think about it, it's not all that different than the British experience, right? The Acts of Union of 1706-7 don't immediately establish a British imperial identity in the North American colonies. The records amongst the Carolinians, the Virginians, and the Georgians in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s is that they're continual at each other's throats about what it all means, right? So in many ways, everybody in North America is sort of asking the same kind of question. Who are we, right? What does it mean to live in 18th century North America? These questions have to be answered over time, and it's a process.
Thank you.
So we have now a question by Peter Barber.
Yep.
Peter?
Yeah, if you can, well, I was going to ask Katherine Porter, first of all, I enjoyed your paper very, very much. And it was very interesting, but I wonder when later on whether you'll be considering the survey of the Crown lands in England, which was commissioned by James I at exactly the same time. It might be interesting to see whether the degree of accuracy of surveys inside England was any more accurate than the surveys carried out in Ireland, and whether, in consequence, that might tell us something about the quality of the surveyors who were chosen for work inside England and the work being done in the colonies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I've thought about in terms of the broader narrative. So the idea that the Crown is needing to sell off lands in some places because of debt, but then they're taking lands in other parts, you know. So that's quite an interesting story in itself. But in terms of the survey involved, yes, that would be a fantastic idea, and it is something that I would love to do, yes, and absolutely compare those sort of comparisons between not only the surveyors who were present and doing the work, but also the practices that were involved and how maybe the methods evolved, or as you were sort of mentioning there, that maybe more effort was put in certain places than others for different reasons, depending on the stories involved at any particular time. But yeah, that would make a fantastic project as well. Maybe we can get some money together.
Well, I think it would be interesting, particularly since the paradigm traditionally has been, at least in the case of Britain, that the surveying done in the colonies was usually of a higher standard than the surveying done in England itself.
Yeah, no, it would be really fascinating. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then Agnès, your host, would like to ask a question as well. Agnès.
Okay, thank you, Karen. This is a question for Katherine. I have many questions for all of you, but let's start with Katherine. I was wondering how you would study the physicality of surveying, because you said you were interested in that, and whether specificities in how, well, this is all your work is about, but would there be specificities to that extent in Ulster compared with the rest of Ireland or with England, as Peter just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, as part, well, coming from my PhD, I was studying maps from 1530 right through to about 1610. So there's a broad range of maps, some which are surveyed, some which are copied or plagiarized, and that happens a lot with the maps of Ireland. But yeah, really digging into that survey detail is a little more complex. And I'm working on some research at the moment on Robert Lythe's map of Ireland. So it's dated 1567, or sorry, yeah, 1567 to 71. And it was a true survey of most of the island, but unfortunately it omitted most of Ulster. So it doesn't help us very much with that province of Ireland. However, what I have been doing is looking at a viewshed analysis within GIS, within the GIS software. So what you can actually do is stand on that part of the ground where they might have stood, say on the top of a hill or the top of a drumlin, and you can see what they could see, and try to figure out if they were taking angle bearings or measurements and things like that. So that's sort of where, you know, the technology side of it is going in terms of the investigation. Yes.
Thank you. And Agnès, you had a question for Michael. Maybe you could go ahead with this as well, and then we'll leave the floor to Larry. So,
sure. Thank you, Michael. That was very, very interesting. I was just wondering, you've shown us plats and you've shown us maps running along rivers, and I was wondering if you could tell us if you had noticed some form of regular process that led from one version to the other. And I was wondering if it was motivated more by market sales, or if there was any involvement from local governments in asking for these surveys. And so please, if you can enlighten me, that'd be great.
And Upper Canada is a bit of a peculiar place for this, particularly in the period we're talking about from 1783 to 1800. There's no formal land market in Upper Canada for land that has not already been granted by the Crown until 1826. So you can obviously sell land that you have been granted, improved, and given title to. And part of that process is to actually get the land surveyed. And there's huge debates about, you know, whether that should be a government expense or whether individual settlers who maybe have received their land as loyalists or as British subjects emigrating can shoulder the burden for that. So what we can see in the records is that a lot of these very general maps of, you know, for example, the Thames River that Patrick McNiff lays out, they direct settlement to those places, and they're very eager to get the kind of general survey plat done for the township that they might be laying out. But when it comes to individual lot lines, those are typically not entirely laid out beyond what's sort of on the page. So that does create some problems that comes later on. And it's typically only after someone has settled on the lot, gotten title to it, or in the process of getting title to it, excuse me, that you'll actually see the formal survey plat be drawn. So for example, when Charles Anderson gets his in 1807, it's a really significant break with the colonial land laws at the time, and a kind of assertion that the Haudenosaunee are doing something that they believe to be in their right, but that the colonial government says that this is not. You should not be able to access surveys as a tool to sort of make this claim to ownership and to governance over that land too. Thanks.
Thank you. So then Larry Tice and then Jim Bennett. So Larry. Larry, are you there?
I am here.
Okay, great.
My question was to Katherine on Northern Ireland mapping. I've studied the mapping of Munster and the influence of the mapping of the coast of North Carolina prior to the mapping of Munster. And I'm just wondering what the relationship is between the earlier mapping of Munster and the mapping of Ulster. And I should say that one of the things that I've argued in my studies, which I would relate to this, is that I've argued that the first to scale mapping done in the British Empire was the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And the tools that were used there were brought back by the same people to map Munster. And I'm just wondering how that relates then to this later mapping of Ulster.
Oh, I would love to have details of your paper related to that then. That sounds very interesting. There probably are links in some perspectives, but what we find a lot in Irish cartographic history is that we have a surveyor who comes in with a task, they do that job and then they leave, and often there's no record of them again. And so being able to connect with the actual surveyors would be more complex. I think it's more likely that we might see links in how the maps were actually used back in London by people such as Cecil, and whether he was laying all of these maps out together to study and try and draw information together from those instead. And obviously he did create some of his own maps from, you know, his own drawings and sketches from existing maps too. Obviously in terms of Munster, one of the chaps I just mentioned earlier in one of the other questions, Robert Lythe, he has a map of Munster, which I'm sure you'll be aware of too. And it was carried out at the same time as some of the other maps that I've been looking at as well, but it is on a slightly different scale to some of the concentrations that I would have had. But it would definitely be interesting to look at the relationship between the different sort of provincial mapping like that as well. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about your research too. So it'd be great if you could send me some info on that. I would love to hear more.
Okay, I will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Jim would like to jump in as well and ask a question to Katherine. Jim, please.
Yes, I'm afraid Mike, you can't see me, but you can hear me, yeah?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm afraid my question's to Katherine as well. I was wondering whether we could tempt you into any speculation about, you know, you were saying that you might be able to move forward into thinking about what surveying practices could lie behind some of these patterns that you've discovered. And it seems to me that the fact that you've been able to get some systematic patterns, that's to say, you know, these displacement vectors are more evident or larger in the south than the north and so on. And this indicates that it's not just incompetence, but there is some underlying reason that you might be able to speculate on. If there's the only thing that I can think of that could possibly be helpful is that if there is any angle measurement going on here, and there may well not be, it may just be done, I suppose, with chains and ropes and so on. But if there were any angle measurement going on, it would have been based on the magnetic compass, I'm sure, rather than, that's to say, not a theodolite, but a surveying compass of some sort, which is more typically used in Ireland. And if that's so, then there is the factor of magnetic variation. The two data sets that you're comparing are, between these maps and the Ordnance Survey maps, are separated by about, what, a couple of centuries. So there might be, it's just a speculation, but there might be something about the change of magnetic variation over time, which may help in some circumstances. And I don't know what sort of data we have on that for that period, but it's something to look into.
Yeah, definitely, Jim. it's something that I've considered as well in thinking through the possible methods of the survey, but I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned chains, because I think that's most likely what we are seeing here. But again, it is conjecture at this point, and I very much want to look at more of the maps, first of all, to see if we can find any common patterns in these maps. I also think, as I mentioned in the presentation, that the landscape itself played a really important role in what we're seeing from the sort of the quantification, if that's the correct word to use, of, you know, these sorts of aspects of the survey. And I think it will become clearer as we begin to investigate some of the other maps as well. We'll be able to build up more of the narrative, see a fuller picture of that. And absolutely thinking about the magnetic compass as well and the change in that, although bear in mind what we're measuring here is a relative displacement as well. So it's not, we're not looking at meters and meters either, you know, but I think that's definitely something that if another paper were to be published on this, that would have to be considered. I absolutely agree. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. The Q&A moment is almost over, but I would like to maybe try to give the floor to Isabelle Charon, who wished to ask a question. Isabelle? No, well, apparently she's not there. Okay, right, so maybe she can send you questions by email. We will send you her questions. Okay, so anyway, time is up because we are supposed now to have a break, a 10-minute break, and then we'll have a round table about maps and digital mapping, which is supposed to begin at 4:10. So a short 10-minute break, and then we will be back. Thank you to all our panelists and to Stephen for chairing the session. That was really a great and stimulating session. Thank you to all of you. Okay, before we listen to the roundtable about maps and digital mapping, we would just like to remind you that a selection of papers will be published in the revue XVIIe-XVIIIth, which is the journal of the Society. And Laurent Curelli, who is the chief editor of the journal, would like to present the journal to you and say a few words about the publication of the papers in the journal. So please, Laurent.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay,
well, thank you, Katherine. Well, I'd like to thank the organizers for this absolutely wonderful conference, very stimulating conference. So thank you. I'm Laurent Curelli, and I'm the editor of Cette, XVIIIth, that's 1718 in English, but in Roman, it's spelled in Roman letters. And this is a peer-reviewed online academic journal. The journal is one of the publications of the French Society for 17th and 18th century studies, Anglo-American studies, under whose patronage this conference is organized. So we publish issues on an annual basis, and among contributions, these issues include the proceedings of the annual conference organized by our society, like the conference you are taking part in today. We publish articles both in English and in French, so we're used to dealing with contributions written in English. Katherine, one of the organizers of this conference, is a member of the editorial team, and so I expect your papers by March the 1st. They will be reviewed in the course of the spring. We've tested open peer reviewing, and we are planning on extending it further this year. I will send you an email shortly with all the necessary details regarding the publication process, as well as guidelines for the layout of the articles. And of course, I'd be very happy to read your contributions. So thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference. And again, thanks, a great many thanks to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. So now I will give the floor to Agnès Trouillet and Robert Clark, who will moderate our roundtable on maps and digital mapping. Please, Agnès and Robert.
Yes, we've agreed I would start briefly. Welcome everyone to this roundtable on maps and digital mapping, the last session of this most stimulating conference. I'm sure you'll join me in once more thanking our ACE host team for their work preparing and managing this meeting over the last 2 days. So thank you, Claire, Karine, and Emmanuel. We have been given to see not only many different maps over sea and land in diverse and distant places and periods of the 17th and 18th centuries, but also a range of digital tools through which panelists have brought these documents to our attention and given us a sense of their materiality, their many functions, their evolution, and some of their secrets. This roundtable on digital mapping is therefore a most appropriate opportunity to discover particular projects and discuss the issues of access to, handling, and use of these objects we might encounter through our research. We have 5 panelists today to whom we can ask questions through the Q&A, and we will submit these questions to our panelists after they have presented. I'm going to give the floor to my co-chair, Robert Clark, now, who will introduce our first 2 panelists. Robert, over to you.
Thank you. Good day, and thanks again. My thanks to join everyone else's to our great team of organisers. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Giovanni Cesarini, who teaches at Stanford and runs their Center for Spatial and Digital Analysis, which is the sort of project which I find deeply, deeply interesting, I have to say, having struggled in that area myself on occasions. Professor Cesarani is an expert in classical scholarship, and of course, having been brought up in Italy, you may well know that it seems like Italian culture is still alive in a direct relationship with the classics. So her first book, Italy's Lost Greece, Magna Graecia, and the Making of Modern Archaeology, is actually, in many ways, a brilliant statement about how many of my friends in Italy still think about the world. There is no kind of gulf between then and now. And so her new project, which involves an extraordinary display of computational skills, and I suspect money to do it, is mapping the British travellers in the 18th century Italy who go on the Grand Tour. And she's unpacking where they go, why they go, what they do when they get there, with a detail which is astonishing and which is only possible really with modern technology. So it's a really great opportunity for us to hear about and see the implications of this. I really recommend her site to you all if you don't know it already. So with that introduction, I'll pass over to Dr. Giovanna and let her take the helm from there. Thank you. What do I push to? Do I push something? Do I need to click?
No.
Nope.
Just mute yourself, maybe, Robert.
Maybe it's you, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Good.
Great. The one thing is that I cannot start the video because the host has stopped it. That's my only problem now.
Well, I had that earlier, but should be unstoppable. You should have had that unstoppable.
Okay. I got permission.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So if now you can see me, I will now share my screen and start the slideshow. And meanwhile, thank you everyone for the invitation, for being here, for the to the organizers, and also for everyone in attendance for being here today, and for this kind and very flattering introduction. Okay. Okay, so yes, I'm here as a member to talk to you about the Grand Tour, which is one of the projects in the larger umbrella, Stanford umbrella project called Mapping Republic of Letters, and which was also in the title for the roundtable. So I think following up on things that I've heard in the past few days, already hinting to the digital and the new possibilities, definitely starting from the title, Mapping the Republic of Letters, attests to the expansion in the meaning of mapping that has originated within the digital humanities, where it now refers to network analysis, conceptual geography, and more, even if some of the maps shown in the keynote last night already pointed how in the 18th century there were alternative ways to cartographic ones to map concepts, time, and history. But in the Mapping Republic of Letters, by relying on the metadata of correspondences, that is the names and the locations of letter writers and letter recipients in early modern Europe, what the project has been doing is bringing a spatial and data approach to the understanding of the ideal borderless intellectual republic of letters of the modern Enlightenment. And this is an example of the Mapping Republic of Letters visualizations, where you see the mapping and putting into place of Benjamin's, Franklin's total correspondence. In the Grand Tour project, though, that you already heard from in the introduction, which is the project I direct within the Mapping Republic of Letters, and here is the current page for the project. What distinguishes us from the larger Mapping Republic of Letters is the focus on the movement of people rather than letters, and in particular, the movement of British travelers to and around Italy in the 18th century. Travelers who participated in what was a fundamental cultural rite of passage for the elite at the time, and remains a fundamental moment for the making of modern ideas and practices for leisure, arts, and professionalizations that we still engage today. The Grand Tour travels involved letter writing. There were letters of introductions and letters sent home to recount travelers' experiences, some of which were then published to become bestsellers about traveling to Italy. And the Grand Tour also certainly entailed a vast movement of objects. So much of what is in modern art collections in Britain, for example, comes from this 18th century travel. But fundamentally, it was about actual travelers moving on the ground along the same developing European roads of the time that were taken by postal couriers who carried written letters for the Republic of Letters all around Europe. So the Grand Tour experience for its participant is really a special experience, and maps have indeed long served to represent it. Preparation for the Grand Tour took place mostly through books, classical texts, and also the travelers studied before going. But I think it is telling that the visual cue in 18th century representations and scenes that you're looking at as soon-to-be Grand Tourist is when they're studying maps. Be this Lord Boyden and his friends in this 1731 painting on the left, or the character of Colin Bridgerton in the popular Netflix series that just came out in recent weeks. It is looking at the map that tells you this, you're looking at a Grand Tourist. Yet, and perhaps ironically, in the Grand Tour project, the relationship between digital visualizations and geographical maps has been, I find, a testy one and remains a work in progress. In the time that I have remaining, which is not much, I would like to share a few episodes of this challenging history of mapping in the Grand Tour project. But first, let me tell you about our data. At the core of the project is the transformation of a print resource, this extraordinary dictionary of travelers to Italy in the 18th century. And what we did is to transform this into a digital interactive database comprising more than 6,000 entries, rich with biographical informations and tens of thousands of data points about the travelers' journeys. And here I show you a screenshot of one of the many Google Sheets that constitute our database when you look at it in Google Sheets. So this richness varies tremendously from entry to entry. For some travelers, much is known. For others, very little is known, sometimes even barely their name. How much is known about different travelers corresponds often, but not always, to class and status. We tend to know more about elite travelers than about their servants and other companions. There is also a great deal of uncertainty and incongruousness in both the historical record, of course, that comes to no surprise to any historians, but also in how the digital transformation itself has been operating. And moreover, of course, we all know the data, the total number of travelers is far from complete. There were, of course, many more than 6,000 British travelers to Italy in the 18th century. Yet, incomplete as the data may be, it provides an incomparably more than what used to be known and analyzed in scholarship about British travelers to Italy. And it is therefore this data, and this is an example of our interactive database that will be soon public and for everyone to use. There is so much that is ripe for a quantitative analysis and digital visualizations. Yet, the richness of all of this information was for us difficult to translate into meaningful cartographic expressions. We first tried mapping with Palladio, the visualization tool created together with our mapping Republic of Letters colleagues, the same one that you saw at the basis of the Benjamin Franklin's correspondence visualizations. And here you see one such result, which is a great snapshot of the totality of our travelers' journeys organized by city. But what happens here also is that there is a flattening of the sense of time, an obscuring of the variations between individual travelers and between different categories of travelers, women versus men, artists versus elite young men, etc. And also not an easy way to represent the uncertainties or the absences in the historical record. So very quickly in our project, we started experimenting beyond Palladio. And I'm about to show you one such experiment that revealed us further challenges. So this is in early representations in which we try to put our data onto an historical map and distinguishing at the same time the multiple layers of data and the different meanings we could attribute to them. And this is, I show it, but you will not find it in the finished project as a working map, because it was one of the moments when we found our digital visualizations quite unsatisfactory. So for a while, we also have actually found most useful for our data representations outside of cartography. And one of the most successful ones is this interactive bar chart. And I now want to send you, I would like to send you, well, you can see that, like I'll send you the link afterwards and you can play with these or analyze this, because this is an interactive, available already visualizations, where you see the 69 architects in our databases and their travels, even if they are represented in these bars. And what I particularly find interesting here is that we managed to attend both to travelers' movement in space, but also in time. In particular, if you look at the bottom, you will see that we managed to solve a distinct problem of mapping 18th century Italy. Because let's not forget that Italy was divided in many different political states in the course of the 18th century, independent and greatly fluid and changing in nature in terms of their political boundaries. And it's a hard thing for any 18th century maps that they change throughout the century. And so we managed to solve the problem in this type of representations, the DOE of travel, time and space, where the DOE is not cartographic. So I have talked of challenges in our project's digital cartography, but I don't mean to be negative, but I took the occasion to share these concerns because they are really still something that remains at the core of our thinking as we prepare to launch the project as the Grand Tour Explorer digital database. In this, which I already showed you a screenshot earlier. So as we will, in this launch and public launch of the project, there are indeed maps. There is individual maps for each individual entry, and you see here on the right, which in the live version you will be able to animate and reanimate so as to follow the progression in time of travelers and sized moreover through different destinations, and the destination sized according to the length of time spent in each place. So a lot of the experimenting beyond the cartographic that we did in these years applies, and this carries over in this kind of individual maps. And there is also going to be a general map that really functions as a reference for all the site, where every destination is represented, and where again, we carried forward the experience of trying to color code by state of pertinence, which was such a huge insight from the mapping the travels of architects. Yet I cannot resist the fact and the thought that I think there is much more that can be done. And I also have the confidence, though, that this more will be done in the future. And as with every digital project, at some point publication needs to happen, and we have to move and share with the public all our data, as we intend to do in the coming months. And in fact, I hope that this will be an effect of the publication. We'll also have others engaging with the issues of how do you map and cartographic represent or otherwise the travelers in our data set. And you know, one of the most interesting cartographer working in another period, but working today in digital cartography, Bill Risking, really keeps saying in his work that what we are waiting for is new, different and interesting ways to map travel and time. And I hope that our data set will provide such inspirations. And in fact, as the last very slide I want to show you is actually the work done by one of our undergraduates in one of our courses, Anne Rutterdorf, where she managed to put in a digital static representations, mapping what Marianne Starkers in 1800 letters from Italy presented as possible itineraries for tourists in Rome. And Anne managed to pack so much and different information and spatial and of value in this interesting map, which I leave with as the hope for future developments by younger scholars, and also an attestation of interesting and innovative in the 18th century itself, representations and thinking about time and travel in the Grand Tour were. And I hope that I stayed on time, and I pass on the baton to the next presenter.
Well, thank you. We're now going to move to, thank you very much, that's fascinating. And of course, the complexity of the information it can only be really experienced when you click on the buttons and see and mine down into it. We're now moving on to Sophie Vasset, who is Associate Professor at the University of Paris and has written several books, The Physics of Language, about 18th century medicine, and bellies, bowels and entrails in the 18th century. Sophie is working on a project which is a little similar, or at least has some kind of overlap with conceptually with Dr. Giovanni Cesarini, which is essentially the mineral waters and the spa culture of 18th century England. So if Sophie is there, we will now pass the baton to her. But I see no indication on my screen.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Agnès,
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Very
Great.
good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful conference. It's been very enlightening, especially when one is struggling with maps, as I'm going to tell my story. Thank you, Giovanna, for not being negative at all, but just sharing some of the problems that are actually uplifting to learn about. I thought I would just share a few questions because this is a roundtable, so I will briefly present my subject today and what I'm working on, which is totally work in progress. What the conference has shown is that maps are the result of political, aesthetic, epistemological, editing choices. And I'm in the middle of all that right now because I have to make choices. Here's the context. I've been working on a book on 18th century British spas. And one of the ideas of this book is to emphasize the great variety of spas in 18th century Britain and the various categories, the fact that they were not just for the elite, but had a very wide usage, and some of them are short-lived. In other words, spas are way beyond the history of Bath. It's a wide range phenomenon. And there was one map available as I was working on the history of spas, and this map is from a very complete, thorough survey of spas in early modern Britain by Phyllis Hanbury, and I'm going to show it to you. And this, if I can find it right, sorry. Oh, I don't have it here. So I'm just going to show it to you in the book. That's going to be simpler. Sometimes you have to be very material. So basically, this was the map available. So you had a few numbers scattered on the map of England, and you had to find your way. So and then the spas are organized by number, but not alphabetically. So say you wanted to find St. Mungo, which is a very important, very small cold spa in Yorkshire. Well, it was really difficult because you couldn't really find where the spa was. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do my own map of 18th century British spas. And I had no idea what I was getting into. At our university, we have an organization called Geographic, and they're very, very helpful because they are working really at the service, I should say, of, oh no, this is my map, so I'm going to stop sharing that. They're working for other scholars and from their own project and try to translate what they're working on in a map. So I went to see them. And one of the first questions I was asked was, so what will mapping 18th century spas will bring to you? Like, what kind of new information will you get from there? And then I must say I was a little off-put by this question, which was very relevant and very simple. What would the map bring? Especially what would it bring over, say, a table or a chart? And we've just seen charts and tables, so I think in some ways they go together. And then her second question was, so what should we use as a background map? Should we use an 18th century map or should we use a contemporary map? And again, we chose a geolocalized contemporary map, but how does this represent a reality of the 18th century? So that was my second problem. Third problem, and Giovanna, I think you mentioned it briefly. I realized that because you build a map from a table, when you're a historian, when you're working in literature, I work in both fields, you have a lot of empty boxes in a table. Well, a map will not accept any empty box. They need to be filled, all of them. And so what kind of information would I get? How would I fill my boxes so that it should be translatable into a map? So that was my fourth problem. Now, fifth problem, context. I was very happy thinking, okay, I've written my books, I'm going to go. I still have 5 minutes, right, Robert? To go.
You have more like 3 minutes, Sophie.
3 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll show the map in 30 seconds. I thought I would walk around Britain and, you know, look at the archives and everything. So I ended up on Google Maps exploring you know, where the spas were on the map from 18th century treatises. And so that was quite an odd experience. All in all, I managed to have a map of 18th century British spas. And it's really a work in progress, but it tries to show various, can you see it? Yeah? It tries to show various categories of spas. And here are the men's spas, spas is in red. And then there are spas of second category, like they will be written about, and there will be some theories about them. But the most important category is the third category, which suddenly shows that there was a local spa wherever you lived, basically. But it also shows empty spaces. Yep. And you can see, for example, Cornwall has no spa, whereas Yorkshire has a lot of them. London as well, that's another point that is shown by the map, that it's neither entirely a countryside phenomenon nor an entirely metropolitan phenomenon. But that information may be biased as well. The fact that there are so many spas in Yorkshire is also informed by Thomas Short, because he was a Yorkshire physician roaming all over Yorkshire, looking for spas and writing about them. So in the end, you know, what kind of reality does this represent, and does this map represent? I could talk about this map forever. I could also talk about the fact that, you know, there are informations coming when you click on a spa, giving several sources. But how will that be translated into a paper map for the book? And I feel like one digital map will give a lot of paper maps. Here's my experience so far. I think I have finished my story with so many questions. You know, where should the additional information appear? What should be the frame? What scale? What background? What is the degree of the density that should be shown? In any case, it's been a very interesting experience for me to try and set up this digital map.
Thank you, Sophie. I guess I'll, oh, Robert, do you want to?
No.
Quick comment? No? Okay. Thank you, Sophie, for sharing with us so openly and so candidly your process and the difficulties you've encountered. Now, if Rosemary is ready, I would like to introduce her now. Rosemary Zagari is Professor of History at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. She is the author of 3 books and many scholarly articles, and a specialist in early American political history and the history of women and American politics. In 2010, she was president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And from 2016 to 2019, she served as the primary historical consultant for the Mapping Early American Elections project, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Rosemary, over to you.
I'm here, but I'm trying to find my PowerPoint. It was there. Let me just see. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm not finding it.
As it is just a rather short presentation of your project before the discussion, do you want to proceed without it, or do you want somebody else to take over before you speak? Or oh, there it is.
Oh, where is it?
I see Zoom. Yeah, you need to click on your presentation. Maybe we can.
Oh, sorry. There. Okay, there we go. Sorry.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm sure we'd all rather be in Paris, but I feel like we have our own little republic of letters here. So the era from the ratification of the US Constitution in 1789 until 1825, the eve of Andrew Jackson's election, was one of the most important periods for shaping American democracy. This is the period in which larger numbers of white males were eligible to vote, in which the earliest political parties emerged, and in which Americans tried to create a unified nation out of 13 fractious states. The Mapping Early American Elections website provides maps and other election data that enables researchers to study this period in new ways. Although critical to understanding American political history, the study of early American elections has been very difficult before now. Before 1825, the US government did not require states to report detailed election tallies to any central location, just the outcome of who won. As a result, there was no single archive or repository where the results were collected. Several decades ago, Philip Lampe of the American Antiquarian Society undertook an exhaustive search to locate the records of these elections in state archives, local museums, town newspapers, and elsewhere. He eventually compiled a collection that contains more than 23,000 elections for over 44,000 candidates at the local, state, and federal levels. This information has been digitized and preserved at the New Nation Votes database, shown here. But this is just the raw data, the election totals and the candidates and the locations where they were elected. And what this project wanted to do was look at primarily congressional elections. But the US Constitution delegated enormous powers to each state legislature to determine its own election laws in voting for president and members of Congress. No two states had the same laws or procedures. States didn't necessarily vote on the same day. They didn't have the same methods of electing members of Congress, nor the same requirements for allowing individuals to vote. One extreme example of this decentralization is found in the fact that from 1776 to 1807, New Jersey actually allowed unmarried women to vote on the same terms as men. So the electoral data must be interpreted in light of changing state election laws. The Mapping Early American Election Projects builds on the New Nation Votes database. Most of the maps on our site are of elections to the lower house of Congress, the House of Representatives. While the New Nation Votes database can be considered a transcription of the election returns, and that's what you see in this example, the mapping project takes the raw numbers and turns them into a data set. This data set standardizes the information and links the results of individual congressional elections with spatial data to create maps. And it's very reminiscent, the process of what Katherine Porter was describing in her presentation earlier. This map, for example, shows the results of the second congressional election in 1791 in Pennsylvania. I want to point out a couple of features that are built into the map. The black lines represent the districts, and each individual district elected their own congressman. And then the dotted lines represent county boundary lines. And the different political parties, the Federalists, are green, and the deeper shades of green represent a higher proportion of voters. Democratic Republicans are blue. The white areas are areas where we did not have sufficient data to present anything. There's an enormous amount of information embedded in the maps, including changes in the historical boundaries of counties, of districts, and of states, and changes in election laws and election procedures, and changes in the names of political parties. The Mapping Early American Elections homepage contains essays that contextualize the maps. This context is important for analyzing the data and understanding the maps. Political parties in this period were fundamentally different from political parties today, and a working knowledge of this information is essential to interpreting what's on the site. Each page, and we have all the elections, 4 members of the House of Representatives from 1789 to 1825 for each state, and the number of states grows immensely from this period, from 13 states in 1789 to 24 states in 1825. But for each election, we then list the candidates, and we list their parties, we list the total votes and the percentage of votes, and who was elected. Besides the map, the site shows this kind of information and also provides links to the raw data in the New Nation Votes database. In addition, when the information is available, we have our maps report election returns down to the county level. And so I want to emphasize that some of these congressional elections took place at the state level. Most of them took place at district level that were drawn by the state legislatures, but we have data for many places down to the county level, which gives you a granular level of information about popular political sentiment. And so this visualization shows you click on a county and this little box comes up, and you have the congressional district in which the county is, the number of votes for the one party, the Federalists, and the percentage, the number of votes for the other party and the percentage. And here's another example of that. And as I say, this is an interactive feature on all the maps. By mapping early congressional elections, the site helps cast new light on the development of American political and electoral history. Studying the maps can reveal changes in party competition, the emergence of new political parties, and changes in voter turnout. For example, these maps show the resurgence of the Federalist Party during the War of 1812. As you see in 1806, the Federalists, which are in blue, dominate the state of North Carolina. And then by 1815, because of opposition to the War of 1812, you see that, the Democratic Republicans dominated in 1806. And then by 1815, because of opposition to the Democratic Republican sponsored War of 1812, you see a resurgence of the Federalists in green in this map. And again, you can see it down to the county level, not just the districts, which are bounded in black. This is another way of looking at the data in the maps we show. You can see here, in New Jersey, the state legislature in 1810 required the congressman to be elected throughout the whole state. All voters would vote for all congressmen, and so that privileged the Democratic Republicans. Then in 1812, the Democratic Republicans dominated the New Jersey state legislature and put in a new system of voting, a district system where each district voted for its own congressman, and that highlighted the power of the Democratic Republicans. And so 4 Democrats and 2 Democratic Republicans were sent to the House of Representatives then. Tutorials on the website show users how to make new maps. There are countless other maps that you can make from our data set. Most of the maps show the results of elections to the U.S. House of Representatives, but we also show a sampling of maps from the election data to the state legislative assemblies. We show examples from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, but you can use the data from the New Nation Votes database and make your own maps. Other maps could also be made using the data for the congressional elections. And here's a couple of examples. This is showing the election results by voting percentage for party. Federalist voting in Maryland in 1789 versus anti-Federalists. And what that shows you, what that highlights, is that the Federalist strength was in the far western and far eastern parts of the state, whereas the anti-federalist voting was dominating the central part of the state. Another kind of map that you can make is of incumbency. This shows the number of members of Congress that were reelected or held over from election to election. And what you can see from this map is that the southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, South Carolina, tended to reelect their congressmen over and over this long period from 1789 to 1825. And the best part of these visualizations is that they then lead to new questions about the political process that is going on. So you can ask of this map, why is it the southern states clung to their particular representatives and reelected them time and time again? And one hypothesis could be is that an older form of deferential politics stayed on in the South, whereas it was disappearing in the North. The Mapping Early American Elections project provides an unmatched resource for studying the early decades of US political development. It is far superior to printed election atlases, of which many exist for these congressional elections in particular, and to the much older online ICPSR database that some of you may have heard of that is located at the University of Michigan, which is very incomplete. The visualization of congressional elections in our database and website make it possible to ask new questions about political participation in the first decades of the nation's existence. The tutorials allow users to ask their own questions and make their own maps. We invite teachers in the classroom, researchers, political scientists, as well as historians, journalists, and students of politics everywhere to explore the mapping website's many possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. That's an amazing data set and amazing use of it as well. Thank you very much. If Nicholas is ready now, I would like to, yes, introduce him. Nicholas Glisserman is a historian, geographer, and as a proponent of digital humanities, he's currently earning a degree in computer science. So well done. Most recently, he was the chief academic officer at Game Learning, where he designed and developed 6 historical video games focused on early American history. For these. Prior to that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and was a visiting assistant professor at Haverford College. Nicholas holds a PhD in history and an MS in geographical information science and technology, both from the University of Southern California. And he is going to present to us his paper on early maps as a source of geohistorical data, the case of the 1760 Murray Atlas.
Hey, everybody. Okay, can you hear me okay? And can you see the... Perfect, okay. So in the final months of 1760, in the middle of the 7 Years' War, right after the British conquest of Quebec, they conduct a survey, a rather extensive survey of the St. Lawrence River Valley, which you can see here. And this is done under the direction of the military governor of Quebec, James Murray, hence the name of the Murray Atlas. And what you see here is imposed on some aerial photography, the various sheets of this survey. So there are 44 of them, and when they're fully assembled, they measure 45 feet by 36 feet. So just to give you a sense of the scale of this thing. So I'm going to talk to you today about my experience digitally processing these maps. That is to say, georeferencing them, contorting them so that they kind of fit on our modern understanding of the geography, and creating layers. Vector data is kind of the technical term, but layers on top of them so that we can actually query or ask questions about what's there. And what you can see here is just kind of what this project looked like at the end of this process, right? So 10,000-foot view. The big question I had going into this project is, our historical maps, our early maps, are these good sources of information to do the work of historical geography? I think, you know, so okay, accuracy, right? This is a big word. It's used a lot. It's often used imprecisely. And so I kind of want to resolve that here by thinking about categories of accuracy. And so today I'm going to especially talk about positional accuracy. That is to say, if I'm looking at a church on the historical map and I kind of use the map to calculate what the coordinates of this should be, if I go to the physical place, am I standing on top of this church? Is it right in front of me? Is it, you know, on the horizon? Is it thousands of miles away, right? So where do we expect the thing, and then where is it, right? And then the other question is of completeness. So, you know, if I'm looking at a map maker and they've depicted a dwelling on a map, right? Was the dwelling ever there? Did the map maker just put it there for aesthetic reasons? Or was it there because the map maker was, you know, keeping detailed track of all of the houses they saw when they were doing a survey, right? So, and then conversely, are there houses or dwellings, to stick with that example, that were in the physical landscape that didn't make it into the map? So that's kind of how complete are the data from that, you know, particular geographical phenomenon in the broader set of the map, right? The project that I did kind of had 3 stages, and I'm gonna skip over the first one, but it did start in the archives, and it started with visual analysis of the maps themselves. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the digital processing of these maps and using demographic sources to get at that question of completeness. Okay, so the first step is to actually create what is called vector data. And what I would say here is, if I have a question like, how far away is this house from this river, right? Well, before computers, I would take out a ruler, I would figure out what the scale of the map is, and that's how I would kind of get an answer to that question. And it would be sort of a tedious process. Computers maybe make it a little bit faster, but there's a lot of work you have to do to be able to get to that answer beforehand. So, you know, we scan the map, and then we have matrices of pixels, and each of them has a value that represents a color, right? And that makes, you know, I can look at that and it makes sense to me, but if I'm a computer, and I'm a human, so, but if I'm a computer, that makes, you know, it's not intuitive, right? So we need to disambiguate the information that we see for the computer. We do that by creating layers on top of the paper map, tracing over them, and you can kind of get a sense of what that looks like here. And then we actually need to adjust the spatiality of the map. So what I did is identify a number of control points where I am confident this is something that is depicted in the map, but it survives or persists in the present. So you know, I'm confident about the location in the past, and I use those to collectively enact geometrical transformation. This is kind of getting back to, I think, Katherine Porter's paper, because you can use this to talk a little bit about or think about the surveying process or the drafting process. But you know, you can also you know, so it's kind of an interesting thing, in just that there's a few different implications of what you can do with it. What I ended up with was a pretty good transformation, in that just when you superimpose it on top of aerial, you know, modern day images, generally you see pretty good alignment consistently throughout the survey, and you can kind of see what that looks like here. Okay, so now I have my dwellings and I have my rivers, and I could theoretically, and they're adjusted, right? So I can ask the computer now, how far away is this house from this river? But here's the problem is, you know, if there was no house there in the beginning, then I'm asking a bad question, or the answer I'm going to get back is meaningless, right? So we need to find some way of taking, you know, so I'm working with dwellings in this case to figure out the completeness question. let's say that a dwelling equals, there are 7 people living in a dwelling. That's kind of the number that historical demographers use in this period in this place. So let's say that's the number. If we look at a census, if we look at parish registers recording deaths, births, marriages, do our demographic sources align with each other? Before we can answer that question, we need to know what the bounds of enumeration are, right? So where is the parish precisely? And that is not necessarily an easy question to answer. And actually, you would kind of hope that it would show up on the maps because they explicitly discuss parishes. And you can see that here. They have some commentary on the parishes. But they don't actually show you where the boundaries are. And it's not necessarily apparent in a lot of these cases where those would be. There aren't abrupt discontinuities in settlement, right? So the way I resolved this problem was actually aggregating parishes together into regions where you could see a very firm break between one parish and another parish. And that then let me kind of do that work with censuses and with parish registers. Okay, so first the census. This was kind of an interesting find. The British do undertake about 5 censuses in the 5 years following conquest. And as it turns out, these are rubbish. They're no good. They actually just internally are inconsistent with each other. So we're going to throw those out. We're not going to use those to ask a question about the map, right? So, goodbye. So we're going to look at parish registers instead. And this is also a source space that has some issues. So, okay, so again, these are recording things like births, marriage, or baptisms, technically, marriages, deaths. Not every parish for every year has a parish register that survives. So that's kind of the big issue, right? And you can kind of, I've mapped this out across time here and across space, so you can get a sense of where this is a really big issue and where it isn't and when as well. So we can kind of use some demographic methods to, sample what the missing registers might have said, and we can kind of come up with some population estimates that way. But this is still problematic because what a parish register doesn't necessarily tell you a lot about is migration. So you can kind of guess what the population is maybe at the colony level. But when it comes to somebody could be born in one parish and then move to another one. So where do you count them? You don't necessarily know, right? So I ended up working with a slightly different metric, which was the births, the baptism records. And again, using that estimation of 7 people per house, what is the crude birth rate that you would come up with? And what, is that totally off the wall? And, do you get really weird numbers if you do that? And in 2 places, you kind of get to the edge of what seems extremely, the kind of edge of what seems likely. But otherwise, everything holds up and there's nothing that's just weird. So I think that the conclusion here is that it seems like the maps actually could be useful as demographic sources, not necessarily to tell you with a great deal of precision what the population is, but to give you some kind of idea of the distribution of population. And once you can do that, you can start to ask some pretty fun, interesting questions. How am I doing on time? Am I?
You should really conclude now. We have one more.
So I'll just stop here. If anybody has any questions about this, please do ask.
No, but they're great questions. Thank you. We'll get back to that. Thank you, Nick. So if I would like to now introduce our last but not our lead speaker, Angel O'Donnell, who's a lecturer in liberal arts at King's College London. He's a historian of early American print culture and is currently completing the manuscript of his first book on the 1776 Pennsylvania State Constitution.
Angel is also the fellow liaison for the Georgian Papers program, a 10-year interdisciplinary project to digitize, conserve, catalog, transcribe, interpret, and disseminate 60,000 items in the Royal Archives and the Royal Library at Windsor Castle that relate to the Georgian period. On a personal note, I heard Luke introduce David Armitage not long ago, and I was very impressed. So Luke, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm on this roundtable today to talk about my new project, which is tentatively titled A History of Mortgages, the Early American State and Investment in the Pennsylvania Paper Industry, 1690 to about 1819. And I'm in the early stages of designing the project, but it's already clear to me that mapping and space will be a significant feature of this project. And as such, these past 2 days have been an absolute masterclass in the kind of discussion and analysis of mapping. And I've just, right now really enjoyed hearing about the sort of problem solving and iterative process that we've just heard from kind of Giovanna, Sophie, Rosemarie, and Nicholas. So thank you again to the organizers, to everyone who gave papers, and for all the brilliant questions that are posed. It's been really fantastic to hear from you all. So as I said, I am in the early stages, so I'm afraid I don't have much in the way of research outputs to share with you. Instead, I wanted to talk you through how I'm framing the questions for this project and how I'm thinking about space and maps in that project. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to do 3 things. First, talk you through my research aspirations, what it is I want to achieve. Second, talk a little about the sources that I'm using and that underpin the project, so you can have a sense about the sort of issues that I'm encountering. And third, talk you through how I'm framing questions in the project in response to the literature on map, space, place, etc. And then kind of leave those questions with you. Okay, first things first, my research aspirations. My big goal for this project is to write a history of mortgages, because I think that mortgages have been have played an underappreciated role in providing capital for investment in industrial projects. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between industrial entrepreneurs and the early American state. And I think that mortgages will provide useful insight into kind of mortgage law, conceptions of property rights, as well as helping us to understand the structure of government and the civic institutions that grew out from those structures. So that's the kind of aim that I'm doing. And I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to get into it if anyone is interested or if people do think it's relevant. What I think is most important for this roundtable and why I wanted to bring my project to this conference is that I'm interested in designing a board game that would engage people with the history of mortgages. I'm hoping to inspire curiosity about mortgages in both my students in the university, as well as others outside the academy. I want to design a game that provides an access point to this potentially dense and intimidating topic, find a way to start a conversation about mortgages with people who might not otherwise want to talk about its historic development. And crucially, I think that the sorts of discussions I think the sort of discussions that you are all having about maps will meaningfully inform the sort of thinking that I'm doing about board games. So unfortunately, I don't have a kind of fleshed out version of the game to share with you all, though I do have some practical first principles that were agreed at a workshop. And instead, what I want to do is talk about how we as researchers approach public engagement and how we might balance play against the needs of scholarly precision. Okay, so the history of mortgages is my big goal. And I'd like to build engagement with that research by experimenting with a board game about mortgages. And those are my kind of research aspirations. So moving on to my second point, I'm going to give a quick overview of the sources that I'm using so you can have a sense about the sort of space issues entailed in the history of mortgages. Perhaps no big surprise, but this research will concentrate on using property ownership documents, so like deed books and mortgage records, and there are a few others too. And then added to this is John Bidwell's Directory of Papermakers in America, which lists the 681 people and 131 mills associated with the paper industry in Pennsylvania. And my aim with these sources will be to build up a database of industrial buildings, their owners, their debtors, and their creditors. And from there, I think we can analyze how mortgages contributed to the development of the Pennsylvania paper industry and discern something about how mortgages functioned in early America. These property ownership documents lend themselves to a spatial analysis because I believe they describe a changing ontological relationship with the environment. In many cases, the value discussed in these documents is determined by their geographical location. We can understand why creditors lent and debtors borrowed if we can understand where the mortgage lands were in the Pennsylvania landscape. Were there good roads, good water sources? What other properties were close by? And these are interesting questions in their own right. But I was drawn to this conference here because I intuitively understood that these property ownership documents pose complex problems, right? The precision of the boundary line described or sometimes drawn in these records disguises the fact that it was much more difficult to actually locate that line in the landscape. Even the simplicity of setting a boundary line belies the kind of complex set of issues associated with parceling land and apportioning ownership. To take just one issue among many, what do you do about water rights and who else uses that water? And how do you control what your neighbor does with that, right? So ultimately, the reading I did in preparation for this conference, as well as hearing all the kind of papers over the past few days, together, these have helped me appreciate and understand these complexities. Mapping and spatial humanities have kind of helped me see the potentially productive tensions within the sources for mortgages, as well as address those tensions with more nuance. So those are my sources and where the kind of secondary literature I'm engaging with. In this third and final part, I want to frame a few questions in response to those aspirations and how using those sources. As I said, reading about mapping in space has really helped me understand the issues associated with mortgages and industrialization. A lot of the literature that I read on this topic does a great job at thinking about how maps provide insight into the way historical societies perceive space and what that tells us about their ontological understanding of the world. Space tells us a lot about the lived experience of historical peoples. And as you've all demonstrated in many and various ways over the course of this conference, maps and mapping provides a valuable lens into the perception and production of space. And I think these various property ownership documents fit into that mode of thinking exceptionally well. So too have the kind of discussions around practices and map-based practices also been really kind of insightful about epistemologies and what we do as scholars in kind of reproducing and perpetuating those epistemologies and our responsibilities with that, especially when digital tools get involved. So it's the topic of public engagement that I'd like to conclude with, and particularly to ask and discuss, what does public engagement mean? So for my own approach, for the board game, I've focused thus far on the concept of homo ludens, a concept originally articulated by Johann Huizinga, but which seems to be a common reference point in the literature I've read about what's called serious games or games for learning. The utility of the homo ludens concept is best articulated, I found thus far, by Bill Gaver. Gaver writes, the idea of homo ludens, humans defined as playful creatures, is an antidote to assumptions that technology should provide clear, efficient solutions to practical problems. From this perspective, we are characterized not just by our thinking or achievements, but by our playfulness, our curiosity, our love of diversion, our explorations, inventions, and wonder. An aimless walk in the city center, a moment of awe, a short-lived obsession, a joke, all are defining and valuable facets of our humanity, as worthy of respect as planning, logic, or study. Play is not just mindless entertainment, but an essential way of engaging with and in learning about our world and ourselves, for adults as well as children. As we toy with things and ideas, as we chat and daydream, we find new perspectives and new ways to create new ambitions, relationships, and ideals. Play goes well beyond entertainment. It's a serious business. And this really struck a chord with me about how I might approach the question of engaging with people about mortgages through a board game. Can we balance play against the needs of scholarly precision? Is that possible? And I think it is, hopefully not a surprise, because it seems to me that maps offer a unique opportunity to achieve that aim, right? Maps help audiences parse information in novel ways. The right map might help inspire curiosity in people who might not otherwise want to talk about the historical development of mortgages. Therefore, to conclude, I have 3 questions. How do you all engage people with your research? Are there ideas from your research into maps, mapping, and space that feed directly into that public engagement question? Do you think homo ludens, as described, is a promising line to pursue? And if so, do you have any preliminary ideas about how we might create or curate maps that would appeal to homo ludens? And I ask these questions not just because they are of interest to my specific project, but because I believe that these types of practice-based distinctions will contribute to the ongoing discussion about the historiographical interventions made possible by maps, a discussion that I've benefited from already and would love to add to. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you very much. I believe before we engage with the questions each of you have asked to one another as you were speaking, I believe Robert wanted to make a few comments.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. Sound good? Yeah. Just segueing across from the last speaker, I published a book recently, Jane Austen's Geographies, and there's a discussion there, a very brief one, of Robert Sayers' 1787 New Royal Geographical Pastime for England and Wales, which is a board game for young ladies to learn about visiting sites in England. So it's actually, well, there is a copy in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and those of us who are interested in sort of cultural tourism and modern mapping projects could just go and look at this. This has been around, in other words, since 1787, qua game, come task, and learning exercise. And I use that as an example of the way Jane Austen herself and then her contemporaries, of course, were taught about geography. Okay, what I was going to try to do was just offer a few key thoughts about the, well, to me anyway, about what we've been, the whole ground of the conference, a bit of a daunting task, but my own take on it inside of one, you know, 300 words at most, which may be helpful, maybe not. Okay. I thought we started obviously with the Elizabethan period, and we had some very interesting papers. The whole conference has been interesting, but these were about sort of the movement from the marvelous to the empirical. You know, Louise McCarthy and Ladan Niash, for example. I mean, the way that cartouche changed from being marvelous objects and the person who reads the map seeing a completely marvelous space towards a foregrounding of the empirical and the practical and the scientific. And I loved the actual discussion by Chloe Fairbanks of the hostility to maps felt in Shakespeare, and particularly around, to my mind, around Cordelia, who, after all, when presented with the map, which gives her the best part of the kingdom, refuses it. And as part of that refusal is an absolute, it's been read in many ways, but it is a refusal of the mentality that could reduce her experience to a map and to a piece of ground like that. And I think that then comes through, you know, Alex Lucas, who talked about Herman Moll's cartouche and how the cartouche now on the map is designed to advance British imperial interests by relating it to, you know, by showing, if you like, Neptune as a subordinate creature admiring King George. And his very eloquent explanation of the ways in which Moll's maps serve a British imperial agenda. And of course, that has run through very many of the papers. What I think we therefore need to sort of put in our general discussion here is that maps are marvelous on the one hand, empirical on the other, and also prospective or projective. Those kind of key terms, because they're actually not representing the real world, which is what we're all taught to believe. They are always servants of ideology and of economic purpose. And today, Michael Borsk, I know I'm picking up people kind of at random, but did a very brilliant sort of explanation about the way maps had struggled to get some kind of authority. And the authority that they're trying to get, of course, is the authority of property. And the whole question of the depossession or dispossession of native peoples, also running through the Ulster maps of Bodley, running all the way through, and then coming up very strikingly, I thought, in Bertie Mandelblatt's paper yesterday on Pennsylvania maps, which is particularly interesting to me because of my interest in Indians, so-called native people. Suddenly, I looked at those maps myself, well, not that one in particular, but the white space compared to, as she showed, a map of the Great Lakes, presumably by a French cartographer, which would show rich population centers. And the white space that is actually on the Pennsylvania map is, of course, denying the existence of these indigenous people. And that is prospective or projective. They wish to remove them, as we know very well. For, you know, we study Winthrop, we hear him talking about people as the Indians as nomads, which was a very common description of them. And of course, it's there in John Locke's "In the beginning, all the world was America." You know, this is John Locke had written the Constitution for Carolina, just to the south of Pennsylvania. The idea of this space as being blank and white and empty is essentially it's a projective extermination of the Indians. Okay. I think it's also there, of course, in Spencer's writing about Ireland in 1599, you know, in the view of the state of Ireland. So this is a long history. And I hope I've given with these key terms some kind of key points where we might want to think about how these maps have worked across this time. And crucially, at the center of this is a word just used in the last speaker, but the ontology. Because when you're making a database, bringing this back to databases, you always have to consider the ontology of the object. What is the object? How have I categorized it? What is its purpose? What is its hierarchy in relationship to everything else? So this is a question which has in a sense been underlying philosophically all of the maps that we've been looking at, because they make presumptions, they contain presumptions about the objects that they represented. For example, the righteousness of property and the absence of nomads who happen to be living in the land. So we should therefore, in our conceptualization of these processes, come back to this term ontology again and again, because when you're making a map of the kind we've just looked at electronically, that is what you have to ask yourself before you even put a pin on the map, or as you put the pin on the map, what is it I am pinning? Okay, understood.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you. We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to ask each person to possibly turn on their video and their microphone in turn to ask those questions to our panelists. So I think the first person was Giovanna, who had a question for Rosemary.
Rosemary, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So and maybe I missed it and you mentioned it in the presentations that were brief, but as I was listening and looking at the wonderful maps, I wonder, and I mean, also this reveals my ignorance of the period, but is it also possible to know how many voted, the percentage of voting people among those eligible to vote, and then how those relates to the total population at the time? I mean, there was the maps that you showed are like the maps we've been looking at constantly in the US for the past month. And I just wonder what information is available for the period in that sense, yes, and if it is something that your website allows to do.
Yes, well, our website has the total voters for these localities. And I've actually done it for a county in North Carolina. You just have to use the census records and compare the voter turnout with the census records to get the percentage of the white male population to get the voter turnout. But we do have an essay on our website where Andrew Robertson does that too. So yes, thank you for the question.
Okay, the next question was from Louise to Angel Luke.
I'm sorry, yeah, that was bugging. I think it's not really a question. Well, it's more, I just wanted to know a bit more about that game, because when you mentioned the game about, a board game about mortgages, I envisioned a mix of Monopoly and Risk. Could you say a bit more about what you're envisioning precisely? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, what we kind of talked about in this workshop is, it's a while ago now, but we basically said, is this a viable thing to do? Is this the way to do it? So we talked about some of the first principles, the things that we might have to do. We decided that the sort of scale we're talking about is about 15, run in a 2-hour session where we play, as it were, for about 90 minutes. And then what's crucial, as it came from the sorts of discussions, is what was really crucial is we have a 30-minute debrief session. So the learners and all the people who participated in it can kind of consolidate their knowledge of that situation, of the sorts of activities undertaken, and they can have, that's where it opens the conversation, right? We then had to, you know, I had a few rules, as perhaps known to some of you, Max Adling joined us and very quickly pointed out that all the kind of first attempts at trying to match up how much something should cost and where money should go, all that sort of stuff, doesn't work. And he spotted that straight out, right? And one thing that's came out very quickly is that sort of fine-tuned precision will need to be done in playtesting. COVID threw out the window. So there are no kind of draft rules available there, but it's certainly envisioned as where the kind of core activity is discussions and thinking about changing and how the kind of interactions work, and then having a debrief session. So those are the first principles, and that's the sort of thing we've got, and that's about as far as we have. Again, it's just thinking what sort of theories underpin it, whether it's a good way to do it, and how do we can we embed, and align the sorts of ludic intent, that curiosity, with what we actually want to do and communicate that across, if that makes sense.
And considering the whole COVID pandemic situation, would you consider the option of making a simple video game out of it?
So it actually went the other way. I actually started as slightly gamifying the paper making process until someone who was a practitioner of maker culture. So we brought in people from the industrial heritage sector and a couple from this maker culture, which is this idea you should play with digital and practical tools to do it. Said, well, don't start with a video game. That's far too complicated. Start with the practical physical board game, because it allows more stakeholders to have an input into the design process. If you kind of leave it as a digital product, you're giving over a lot of that initial impetus to designers and programmers and coders. Whereas actually, if you start with something a bit more pen and paper, things like choosing maps, things like those sorts of things, more people can have an insight into it. COVID has thrown more than just this project out of it. It's massively delayed my own book project. So maybe I won't have to fully take on the sorts of lockdown implications that COVID has brought with us. But yeah, certainly thinking bond digital, a bond digital aspect is something I'm interested in.
Right, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Stephen had a question for Nicholas.
I don't mean to shock people. This is Ann Knowles. I'm Stephen's wife, and I've been able to sit in on this session with tremendous interest. I have a question for Nicholas. I'm very interested in your georeferencing of the mosaic. I'd like to know, did you georeference the individual sheets and then stitch them together, or stitch them together and then georeference? And the second question is how you calculated linear distortion, and did you also calculate aerial distortion?
Yeah, those are great questions. I stitched the map together before georeferencing it, and I kind of tried it a few different ways. Essentially, and let me actually see if I can share my screen again. You see that? See that? Okay. Yeah, so essentially, so the British map makers actually provide us a synthesized version of the map, and that was essentially what I was using in stitching things together. So I was just kind of following their own logic, largely because if you just try to align the map sheets kind of in their own scale, things didn't really line up. So that was the first part of your question. I used a quadrat count method, so I created essentially a fishnet of 1 kilometer boxes, and so that, yes, both linear and aerial distortion. So yeah, so does that kind of answer your question, or do you want more details?
Sorry, that's fine. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay. Sorry, 2 questions to Sophie now. The first one from Giovanna.
Sophie, I know some 18th century maps of England, and because of the expanding road networks and so on, but I wonder what the spas, if your spas that you're looking at are represented on the maps, and how, and if that's something that is
Oh,
I think it froze, but I think I got the gist of your question. Maybe I can answer it. I haven't found so far any 18th century either map of spas or so many spas represented on one map. The only thing I have found so far is a map of early 19th century France that showed all the various spas that were known in France at the time. And it's very puzzling to me because there are so many treatises, medical treatises published on spas, and they talk of so many places, but there is no map that goes with them. Whereas there's this whole rhetoric of discovery, you know, roaming the country, looking for spas, but so far I haven't found any maps. That being said, I haven't been in the archives so much because of the pandemic.
Thank you. And the second question to you was from Katherine.
Hi, yes. Sophie, yeah, I was just wondering if you'd thought about other ways of deriving information on spas, in particular, perhaps using crowdsourcing, but also touching on what was just mentioned in relation to historic maps. So maybe trying to source sites of spas from maybe the Ordnance Survey maps of Great Britain. I know that a similar project has been done in Ireland in relation to the Holy Wells, and they are using crowdsourcing and also historic maps to try and find locations that maybe aren't mentioned so much in archives and in literature and things like that.
Well, that was going to be my answer to you. There is a very large crowdsourcing culture around ancient and holy wells. I think partly due to the fact that some of them, a lot of them were destroyed during Reformation. So there's this relationship both in Ireland and also in England. You have lots of groups that are sourcing all the wells and going on specific hikes to find them. I think it's also related, and it's very interesting, to property, as Robert was just mentioning, and the ownership of water, which is a crucial problem also related to spas. About the second technique which you mentioned, no, I have not done that, but this is a great idea, and I will certainly come in contact with the people that you just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and I'm going to read one last question because it's already past our time, from Alan Potowski for Nick. Thank you for the excellent presentation. The Murray Atlas is a nice test case of the thesis of the 18th century superiority of the French school. Generally, the foundation of the École des Ponts et Chaussées in 1747, the Jesuit School of Geography, and the sharing of information with Indian peoples created premium place for geography and geographers in the French Empire. Were pre-1760 French maps of the St. Lawrence Valley as accurate as the Murray Atlas? Is the question Alan is asking you.
I have no idea. I didn't look at any of them using this kind of technique. I mean, what I can tell you is that I did a dissertation in the late 17th, very, very, very early 18th century that was kind of using more traditional history of cartography methods, not using too much GIS. So I wasn't really looking for accuracy in the same kind of way here. So I don't know. It's a great question.
So now you know.
Somebody should definitely answer it.
Thank you very much. So maybe I'll pass the floor now to Katherine for some conclusion, maybe, because it's already we're 5 minutes over time. What do you think?
Yes, thank you, Agnès. So thank you, Agnès and Robert, and thank you to all our panelists of this roundtable and of the whole conference. So everyone is not there anymore because it's quite late, but nonetheless, we were really happy that this conference could take place, and it was really beyond our hopes. It was really a success. We feel that it was a success, and we hope that everyone enjoyed it as well. Maybe to say goodbye, could ask all panelists to turn their video on, so that we'll be a way, therefore, of saying goodbye. And now Pierre would like to say a few words as well.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I won't detain you very long because I know you all need to dash off to the train station or the airport to catch a train or plane back home. So I'm not going to be very long. I just really wish to say thank you very much, everyone, for making this yearly conference of Société d'études anglo-américaines des XVIIe et XVIIIe siècles such a roaring success. So warmest thanks to Agnès, Emmanuel, and Katherine for all the extraordinary amount of work they put in to have this conference in spite of all the odds. Thank you to all our institutional partners in France and to the Athlete Society for providing such support and such help throughout. Thank you to everyone, I mean the plenary speakers, the panelists, the roundtable speakers, the worldwide audience who all contributed to make this a very great success. So, well, wishing you a pleasant journey home, and to conclude, a few words in French, which I'm sure everyone will understand. Au revoir et merci. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.